Reader's Guide to the Marxist Classics. Prepared and edited by Maurice Cornforth. London. Contents. Foreword 1. Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin. Introduction. Engels, Karl Marx, speech at graveside of Karl Marx. Lenin, three sources and three component parts of Marxism. Lenin, Karl Marx. Lenin, Frederick Engels. Stalin on Lenin 2. The basic principles of Marxism-Leninism. Introduction. A. General introduction to Marxist theory. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Stalin, Anarchism or Socialism, B. More advanced reading. Marx, Critique of Gotha Program. Engels, Anti-Dühring, C. History of Communist Party of Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. Stalin, History of CPSU, B. D. Leninism. Stalin, Foundations of Leninism. Stalin, On the Problems of Leninism, E. Imperialism and the Proletarian Revolution. Lenin, Imperialism. Lenin, The State and Revolution 3. Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Introduction. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels, The Origin of the Family. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Lenin, What the Friends of the People are. Lenin, Materialism and Empirio-criticism. Lenin on Religion. Lenin on Dialectical Materialism, Articles, Letters, Notes. Stalin, Concerning Marxism in Linguistics, Marx-Engels Correspondence. Books by Marx and Engels prior to Communist Manifesto 4. Political Economy. Introduction. Marx, Capital. Volume 1. Volume 2. Volume 3. Marx, Critique of Political Economy. Engels, On Capital. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value. Marx, Wages, Price and Profit. Marx, Wage, Labor and Capital. Engels, The Housing Question. Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Lenin, A Characterization of Economic Romanticism. Lenin on the Agrarian Question 5. The Working Class Party. Introduction. A. An Independent Working Class Party. Marx and Engels on the Party. Marx, Inaugural Address. Engels, On Authority. Engels, Marx and the New Rheinische Gazette. Marx and Engels, Circular Letter. Engels, Articles in Labor Standard. Engels, Prefatory Note to Peasant War in Germany. Engels, Peasant Question in France and Germany. B. The Party of a New Type. Lenin on the Organizational Principles, Strategy and Tactics of the Party. Lenin, What is to be done? Lenin, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. Lenin, Left-Wing Communism, C. The Fight Against the Opportunism of the Second International. Lenin on Opportunism and its Roots in the Labor Movement. Lenin on War. Lenin on the British Labour Movement. D. The Communist International. Lenin and the Communist International 6. The Bourgeois Democratic Revolution and the Socialist Revolution. Introduction. A. The Revolutionary Period 1848–71. Marx, Address of CC to Communist League. Marx, The Class Struggles in France. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. The Civil War in France. Marx and Engels on revolutionary struggles in Germany, Spain and the United States. B. The Russian Revolution of 1905. Lenin, Two Tactics of Social Democracy. Lenin, Lecture on the 1905 Revolution. C. Proletarian versus Bourgeois Democracy. Lenin, The Deception of the People. Lenin, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. 7. The Great October Socialist Revolution. Introduction. A. Character and Significance of October Revolution. Stalin, International Character of October Revolution. Stalin, October Revolution and Tactics of the Russian Communists. Lenin. Fourth anniversary of October Revolution. Lenin. Economics and politics of the era of the dictatorship of proletariat. B. The preparation for October. Lenin. Letters from afar. Lenin. Tasks of proletariat in our revolution. Lenin. The April Conference. Lenin. Impending catastrophe. Lenin. Will Bolsheviks retain state power? Lenin. Marxism and insurrection. C. After conquest of power, war, communism and the new economic policy. Lenin. Immediate tasks of Soviet government. The Civil War and intervention. The new economic policy. Lenin. On cooperation. Lenin. Role of TUs under NEP. 8. The building of socialism in the USSR, 1924-39. Introduction. A. Stalin's reports to party congresses. Stalin. Reports to 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 Congress. B. Reports and articles from Stalin's Leninism. 1. The alliance with the peasants. 2. The right danger and Trotskyism. 3. The socialist offensive. 4. Socialist labor. 5. The USSR. Constitution. 9. National liberation. Introduction. Lenin. Right of nations to self-determination. Lenin. Discussion of self-determination summed up. Lenin. National pride of great Russians. Stalin. Marxism and the national question. The October Revolution and the national question. Stalin. National question and Leninism. Stalin on China. Reference index. Index of titles. Forward. This reader's guide has been prepared with the object of helping both students engaged in self-study of the Marxist classics and tutors of political education classes. It aims at giving a survey of works available to English readers in the current standard collections, covering the whole scope of Marxist-Leninist theory. For this purpose, the following classification of the material has been adopted. 1. Writings dealing briefly with the life and work of the four great teachers, Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin. 2. The most basic and comprehensive works setting forth the general principles of Marxism-Leninism. 3. Works dealing specifically with the general principles of dialectical and historical materialism. 4. Works dealing specifically with political economy. 5. Works concerned above all with the principles of the organization, strategy and tactics of the working class party, in the period up to the Socialist Revolution. 6. Works dealing with the development of the democratic revolution in Europe, and with the problems of the transition from the bourgeois democratic revolution to the socialist revolution. 7. Writings and speeches by Lenin and Stalin in the period of the preparation and carrying through of the Great October Socialist Revolution. 8. Writings and speeches by Stalin in the period of the building of socialism in the USSR, up to the Second World War. 9. Lastly, works by Lenin and Stalin on the national and colonial question. A short introduction is provided to each part, and a summary is given of the contents of each work and of the principal lessons to be learned from it. Footnote references to other reading in connection with the subjects dealt with provide a system of cross-references. A reference index is provided at the end of the guide, together with an index of titles showing in what English editions the various works referred to are to be found. It is hoped that this plan will help readers to find their way among the many works available, to decide what to tackle and where to begin, and to get the maximum out of the study of each particular work read. The guide is also designed to help readers to find particular passages dealing with particular subjects, for purposes of study or reference. Lenin's advice that a socialist should form the habit of continually consulting the classics cannot be too much stressed. For example, the reader may be concerned in current political work with questions of nationalization of industry and state capitalism. By the joint use of the reference index and the summaries he will be able easily to find where to consult Engels, Lenin and Stalin on this subject. A word of advice to inexperienced readers. In reading the Marxist classics, one often comes upon whole passages which are found, at first reading, very hard to understand. Sometimes this is due to the inherent difficulty of the subject, sometimes to unfamiliar words, sometimes to the introduction of arguments against persons whom the reader has never before heard of and whose ideas are obscure or perverse. On encountering such difficulties, do not allow yourself to get stuck. Even if you cannot understand the passage, read straight through it, you will soon find yourself picking up the threads again when the difficult passage is past. And with more extensive reading and with greater familiarity with the subject, you can return to the work again and find that your first difficulty no longer exists or at all events is lessened. On the other hand, you stick at the difficult passage and puzzle over it too long, you may grow discouraged and never finish the book at all. As regards difficult or unfamiliar words, it is hoped that this guide, and the various explanations and references given in it, may give some help in the mastery of such words. But words, like many other unfamiliar things, become understood as you become familiar with them and with their use. Marxism is not a dogma, but a guide to action. In studying Marxism, it is never a question of learning certain phrases and definitions by heart, but of learning how the principles of Marxism were developed in the course of the struggle for socialism and how we in our turn can apply and develop Marxism and our own struggle. In proportion as we can advance our study of Marxism, we are equipping ourselves the better for practical political work, and at the same time, in proportion as we ourselves gain political experience, we are equipping ourselves the better to understand and apply the teachings of Marxism. 1. Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin. Introduction. Marx and Engels were the founders of scientific socialism. Their teachings have been continued and developed by Lenin and Stalin. The classics of Marxism comprise the works of these four leaders and teachers. They contain the guiding ideas of the working class struggle for socialism, the building of socialist society and the transition to communism. Marx and Engels showed that socialism was not the invention of dreamers but the inevitable outcome of the development of modern capitalist society. They showed that capitalism was creating its own gravedigger in the person of the proletariat, the working class. Only the class struggle of the proletariat and its victory over the bourgeoisie, to the capitalists, would rid humanity of exploitation of man by man. Marx and Engels therefore taught the working class to be conscious of its own strength, of its own class interests, and to unite in a determined struggle against the capitalist class. They discovered the laws of development of capitalist society, and proved scientifically that the development of the class struggle must inevitably lead to the fall of capitalism, to the conquest of power by the working class, the dictatorship of the proletariat. They taught that the working class must rally around itself all the forces discontented with capitalism, and led them in the storming of capitalism. At the head of all working people it must establish its own political rule, crush the resistance of the exploiters and create a new classless communist society. And they taught that in order to achieve these aims the working class must have its own working class party, the Communist Party. Lenin and Stalin have been the great continuers of the work of Marx and Engels in the new historical epoch of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. Lenin developed Marx's teachings in new historical conditions. Leninism is accordingly defined as the Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. The theory and practice of Marxism-Leninism has been further creatively developed by Stalin, the great disciple and collaborator of Lenin, who now leads the Soviet peoples in the construction of communism and teaches and inspires the peoples of the whole world in the fight for peace, democracy, national independence and socialism. In this part, we introduce to the reader a few of the works dealing specifically with the personalities and lives of Marx, Engels and Lenin, and the services they rendered to the international working class movement. On Stalin, the reader should consult the official biography and the Pravda articles published on his 70th birthday Soviet News booklet. Engels, Karl Marx, speech at graveside of Karl Marx. Engels' article on Karl Marx, written in 1877 for the German People's Calendar, gives an account of Marx's life and work. It shows how as editor of the Rhenish Gazette and one proletariat is a Latin word, denoting freemen, neither slaves nor serfs, who own no means of production. Thus the modern working class, which sells its labor power to the capitalists and from whose exploitation surplus value is produced, is a proletariat. To bourgeoisie is a French word, equivalent to burgess, or burgher, meaning the merchants and manufacturers of the towns. Thus the modern capitalist class is a bourgeoisie. German-French Annual. As member of the Communist League, as exile in England, as founder and leader of the First International, Marx lived and developed his ideas in the thick of the working class struggle. Surveying Marx's theoretical work, Engels singles out as his two most important discoveries: A. The materialist conception of history, B. The final elucidation of the relation between capital and labor, through the discovery of the nature of surplus value. He briefly explains the meaning of these two discoveries. In his speech at the graveside of Karl Marx, Highgate Cemetery, March 17, 1883, Engels again refers to these two great discoveries of Marx. He concludes, Marx was before all else a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute, in one way or another, to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it had brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat, which he was the first to make conscious of its own position. His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work. Lenin. The three sources and three component parts of Marxism. In this brief article, Lenin explains how the teachings of Marx arose as a direct and immediate continuation of the teachings of the greatest representatives of philosophy, political economy and socialism. Lenin shows how, taking as his point of departure the highest point reached by his predecessors, Marx revolutionized both philosophy, political economy and socialism. Marx's philosophy is materialism, and he deepened and developed materialism by means of the conception of dialectics. He carried materialism to its conclusion in historical materialism, by wedding it to the understanding of human society, showing that the economic order of society is the basis on which the whole political and ideological superstructure of society arises. Marx then studied the economic order of modern capitalist society. The doctrine of surplus value is the cornerstone of his economic theory. He traced the development of capitalism from the first germs of commodity economy and simple exchange to its highest forms, to large-scale production, showing that the capitalist system creates the great power of combined labor. Marx elaborated the doctrine of the class struggle, showing that the working class was the social force which was capable of becoming the creator of a new social system. 1. Lenin. Karl Marx. This little book, which Lenin wrote in 1914 while in exile in Switzerland, contains a brief but comprehensive account of all the most essential elements of Marx's teachings, which it summarizes under 7 heads. 1. Philosophic materialism. 2. Dialectics. 3. The materialist conception of history. 4. Class struggle. 5. Marx's economic doctrine. 6. Socialism. 1 cf. Lenin, Marxism and Revisionism, where he shows how the revisionists revise all these three component parts of Marxist doctrine. 7. The tactics of the class struggle of the proletariat. Here the reader will find a. An outline of the main ideas of Marxism in each particular field of study, and b. A vivid demonstration of the consistency and unity of conception of Marxism, which welds all the detailed studies into a single whole, the theory and practice of scientific socialism. Lenin. Frederick Engels. Lenin's article written on the death of Engels in 1895 gives an account of the life of Engels, of his association with Marx and of his main works. Summing up the teachings of Marx and Engels and their services to the working class. Lenin says, in a few words, the services rendered by Marx and Engels to the working class may be expressed thus. They taught the working class to know itself, and to become class-conscious, and they substituted science for dreaming. The emancipation of the proletariat must be the work of the proletariat itself. This is what Marx and Engels constantly taught. In his speech at the unveiling of a memorial to Marx and Engels in 1919, Lenin again briefly summarized the services of Marx and Engels. A further brief summary is given by Lenin in his article on the theory of Marxism. Stalin on Lenin. There are a number of speeches and articles on Lenin by J. V. Stalin. In his speech on the death of Lenin, delivered at the Second Congress of Soviets, January 26, 1924, Stalin took his famous vow to remain faithful to Lenin's behests. There is nothing higher than the title of member of the party whose founder and leader was Comrade Lenin, he declared. Lenin's behests were to hold high and guard the purity of the great title of member of the party, to guard the unity of the party, to guard and strengthen the dictatorship of the proletariat, to strengthen the alliance of workers and peasants, to consolidate and extend the union of Soviet Socialist republics, to strengthen and extend the union of the working people of the whole world. In an article on Lenin as organizer and leader of the Russian Communist Party, written on the 50th anniversary of Lenin's birth, Stalin explains that while there are some who convert Marxism into a set of lifeless and meaningless formulas, Lenin attached prime importance to the translation of Marxism into reality, testing every step by experience, learning from mistakes and teaching others how to build a new life. He then shows how this was manifested in Lenin's work as organizer and leader of the party. In a speech on Lenin delivered at the Kremlin Military School in 1924, Stalin speaks of Lenin as he knew him, as a man and a statesman. He describes how he first met Lenin, the mountain eagle, and then describes his modesty, his fidelity to principle, his faith in the masses, his revolutionary genius. He illustrates Lenin's outstanding characteristics by examples from his work and political leadership. In his interview given to the first American labor delegation in 1927, Stalin deals with the main questions on which Lenin contributed something new in development of the 1CF. History of CPSU. B. Conclusion. Doctrines of Marx. Lenin wholly and entirely based himself on the principles of Marxism, but he developed Marx's doctrines further, in accordance with new historical conditions. That is why Leninism is defined as Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolutions. One in particular. Lenin continued and added to Marxism on the following points. 1. The analysis of imperialism and monopoly capitalism. 2. The dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. The building of socialist economy. 4. The leading role of the working class. 5. The national and colonial question. 6. The working class party. 1. See Stalin, Foundations of Leninism and on the Problems of Leninism. 2. The Basic Principles of Marxism-Leninism. Introduction. The substance of Marxism-Leninism, the basic principles of which have been applied and further developed in the theory and practice of world communism, are expounded in a comparatively few fundamental works by Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin. These are of varying degrees of difficulty, and it is important that the student should select the right works to tackle first. For the beginner, the best introduction to Marxism is to be found in Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. This, therefore, should be read first, and with it may usefully be read Anarchism or Socialism by Stalin. The Communist Manifesto comes next. It should not be attempted first, because there is a difficulty in reading it, arising from its very comprehensive character and compressed style. Next, the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks. These three works, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, the Communist Manifesto, and the History of the CPSU, B, together comprise the most essential basic reading. There is a tremendous amount of material in them, and the student will need to return to them in the light of further reading in order to master their contents more fully. But a preliminary reading of these three works provides an introduction to the whole range of problems covered by Marxism-Leninism. The 10 works included here under the heading of Basic Principles have been classified as follows. A. General Introduction to Marxist Theory, The Manifesto and Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, in which the fundamental ideas of scientific socialism are put forward, together with anarchism or socialism. B. More advanced reading, Engels' great theoretical work Anti-Düring and Marx's Critique of the Gotha Program, where he dealt with fundamental questions of the program of the Working Class Party. C. The History of the CPSU. B. This shows how the teachings of Marxism were applied and further developed in the victorious struggle of the Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin and Stalin. D. Leninism. Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, in which he deals with the basic conceptions and policies of Leninism, as the Marxism of the epoch of imperialism and of proletarian revolution, and Stalin's Problems of Leninism, which deals especially with the dictatorship of the proletariat. E. Imperialism and the Proletarian Revolution. Lenin's Imperialism, which lays bare the nature of imperialism as the last stage of capitalism and the eve of the socialist revolution, and State and Revolution, which expounds the theory of the state and of the tasks of the working class in overthrowing capitalist class rule and instituting the rule of the working class, socialist democracy. A. General Introduction to Marxist Theory. Marx and Engels, The Manifesto of the Communist Party. The Manifesto of the Communist Party, or, as it is most often called, the Communist Manifesto, contains the first and most complete summarized statement of the theoretical principles of Marxism and of the strategy and tactics of communism. It was commissioned by the Second Congress of the Communist League in November 1847, and it was first published in February 1848. This was a stormy period, the period of the February 1848 revolution in France and of the climax of the Chartist movement in Britain, when the working class appeared for the first time on the stage of history as an independent force. Readers who want to know something of the background of the manifesto should read the various prefaces, written by Marx and Engels to different editions published with the manifesto, and should also turn to Engels' History of the Communist League and Marx's Class Struggles in France, 1848-50. The manifesto was an epoch-making document. Up to that time, socialists had been putting forward utopian schemes, imaginary projects for an ideal society, or were engaging in secret conspiracies, while the rising working class movement lacked a revolutionary theory. The manifesto signified the union of scientific socialism with the mass working class movement. Point 1. The fundamental ideas of the manifesto may be summed up under 5 main headings. 1. The theory of the class struggle. The history of all societies since the breakup of the primitive communes has been the history of class struggles. In capitalist society, a stage has been reached when the victory of the exploited class, the proletariat, over the ruling exploiting class, the bourgeoisie, will once and for all emancipate society at large from all exploitation, oppression, class distinctions and class struggles. The conception of the working class struggle set forth in the manifesto follows from Marx's materialist conception of history, the essentials of which are summarized in Engels' prefaces to the English edition of 1888 and to the German edition of 1883. 2. The development of capitalist society. Capitalism itself developed out of feudalism, and the capitalist class is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the mode of production and exchange. The capitalist class has conquered exclusive political sway in the modern parliamentary state. In its development, it has played a most revolutionary role. It has brought into being the great new productive forces of modern industry. But in creating modern industry, it has created its own gravediggers, the proletariat. 3. The development of the proletariat. The growth of the proletariat as a class is accompanied by the growth of its organization, both economic and political. At first, the proletariat is incoherent and scattered. It is originally dragged into the political arena by the bourgeoisie, which must appeal to the proletariat to help fight the remnants of feudalism. The manifesto deals with the stages of political development through which the proletariat becomes organized into a class, and consequently into a political party, combined against the bourgeoisie. While the proletariat fights against all relics of feudalism and for the fullest extension of democracy, it leads the struggle for socialism against the capitalists, a struggle which must culminate in the proletariat conquering power and becoming itself the ruling class. 1. See also Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. 4. From Socialism to Classless Society. With power in its hands, the proletariat makes drastic inroads into the power of the capitalists and into capitalist property relations. From the rule of the proletariat will come classless society, in which will arise new people, new human relations, an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. 5. The aims of the Communist Party. The manifesto contains a trenchant defense of the aims of communism, and it exposes various fashionable brands of socialism as expressions, not of the working class standpoint, but of the reactionary standpoints of other classes, of the decaying aristocracy, the petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie itself. The ideas of communism, on the other hand, are not inventions of any would-be reformers, but spring from the existing class struggle. Communists have no interests apart from those of the working class as a whole. Their policy is to fight for the immediate aims of the class, to form an alliance with every movement opposed to the existing social order, and in the movement of the present always to take care of the future, striving to unite the class for the overthrow of capitalist class rule and for the conquest of power. Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Of all the works of Marx and Engels, this is probably the best for the beginner. Written in a very clear and easy style, it introduces the reader to the basic ideas of scientific socialism. Its 3 chapters were extracted from Engels' much larger work, Anti-Düring. Point 2. The chief difficulty which a new reader is likely to find lies in the introduction, where a variety of philosophical views are discussed. In this introduction Engels deals with the history of modern materialism, and then refutes the views of the agnostics and of the German philosopher Kant. The reader who finds such discussions difficult should read the introduction after and not before the rest of the book. The following are the main points dealt with in the 3 chapters of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. 1. Socialism was first put forward as the dream of an ideal society, a utopia. The Utopian. Socialists Street. Simon and Fourier in France, Robert Owen in Britain, could not show how socialism was to be achieved in practice. For they could not point to the social force, i.e. the working class, whose class interest demanded socialism and whose struggle would bring socialism into being. Engels shows that socialism must be turned from a utopia into a science, which means that it must be based on an understanding of the laws of development of society, of the class struggle, of the contradictions of capitalism, of the role of the working class. 2. Scientific socialism has a philosophical basis, dialectical materialism. 1. The petty bourgeoisie consists of the small proprietors in capitalist society, engaged in private profit-making enterprise through the production and sale of commodities, but not exploiting labor, or not exploiting it on a large scale, small businessmen, shopkeepers, farmers, independent professional people, and so on. 2. The beginning of Chapter 1 is taken from the introduction to Anti-Düring, while the rest of Chapter 1 comes from the first chapter of Part 3. Chaplet 2 is again extracted from the introduction, and Chapter 3 reproduces Part 3, Chapter 2. Dialectics, 1 says Engels, means studying things in their real motion and interconnection. He contrasts this with metaphysics, which considers things, one after the other and apart from each other. Engels goes on to contrast dialectical materialism with the dialectics of the idealist philosopher, Hegel. 3. Marxism extends materialism to the understanding of society and its laws. It demonstrates that the ultimate cause of all important historical events lies in the economic development of society, i.e. in changes in the mode of production and exchange. It is the development of production and exchange which leads to the division of society into hostile classes and to the class struggle. The task of socialists is not simply to criticize existing capitalist society as unjust, but to understand the nature of the capitalist mode of production and its laws of development. The essential nature of capitalism was laid bare by Marx's discovery of surplus value. 4. The fundamental contradiction of capitalism is the contradiction between the social production which capitalism has brought into being and private capitalist appropriation. This contradiction contains the germs of the whole of the social antagonisms of today. And Engels further shows how capitalism in its development necessarily passes through periodic economic crises. Point 2. The solution of the contradiction can be achieved only when the working class, as a result of its struggle, establishes social ownership to match social production. 5. Engels goes on to show how, with the further development of capitalism, capital becomes concentrated into the hands of great trusts and combines. At a certain stage in this process, the state must begin to undertake the direction of production. Yet capitalist state ownership is not socialism, for the workers in state industries are still exploited for capitalist profit. The taking over of productive forces by the capitalist state does not solve the social conflicts. It does, however, bring them to a head, and creates the technical conditions for going forward to socialism. For this it is necessary that the working class should seize political power, taking possession of the productive forces and utilizing them, not for capitalist profit, but for the welfare of society as a whole. Point 36. Here Engels deals with the nature of the state. The state is a product of the division of society into hostile classes, and its function is to preserve the conditions of class exploitation. It has therefore always been the instrument of the ruling class, in slave society of the slave owners, in feudal society of the feudal lords, in capitalist society of the capitalist class. The modern state is essentially a capitalist machine, the organ of capitalist class rule. Point 4. It follows that when socialism has abolished the exploitation of one class by another, there remains no more need for coercion and repression and therefore no need for any social one. See Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, Stalin Dialectical and Historical Materialism. 2. See Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Wage Labor and Capital, Lenin, A Characterization of Economic Romanticism, Stalin, Report to 16th Congress. 3. On State Capitalism and Socialism. See further Lenin, The Impending Catastrophe and Left-Wing Childishness and Petty Bourgeois Mentality, Stalin, Report to 14th Congress of CPSU, B. 4. See Lenin, The State and Revolution. Repressive Force, a State. So the state will wither away. Point 17. Finally, with the establishment of socialism, anarchy in social production is replaced by planned organization. Consequently, instead of being at the mercy of economic forces which they cannot understand, men will be able more and more consciously to plan their lives and make their own history. It is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Stalin. Anarchism or Socialism. This little book was written by Stalin as a young man of 26, when he was leading the party in Transcaucasia. At that time a group of anarchists was disrupting the Transcaucasian workers' organizations, and Stalin set out to explain the ideas of Marxism in opposition to those of the anarchists. The book was addressed to the ordinary rank and file workers, and contains a very simple and popular exposition of the fundamentals of Marxist theory. It is a model of how profound questions of theory should be linked with the immediate tasks of the working class struggle. The book consists of 3 short chapters. The first 2 deal respectively with the dialectical method and the materialist theory. Here are set forth the same ideas which Stalin was to elaborate more fully in his dialectical and historical materialism. The third chapter deals with socialism. Stalin here explains the nature of capitalism, the nature of the future socialist society and of the transition from socialism to communism, the grounds for maintaining the inevitability of the advance to socialism, the nature of the working class struggle, the socialist revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat, the tasks of the working class party. B. More advanced reading. Marx. Critique of the Gotha Program. Marx's critique of the Gotha program deals with fundamental questions of the theory and program of the Working Class Party. It consists of a series of comments on points contained in the draft program prepared for a unity conference of the German working class movement held at Gotha in 1875. Marx's comments were suppressed by the opportunist leadership of the German Social Democratic Party and were subsequently published by Engels in 1891, against the wishes of the leadership. The intention of the draft program, the Gotha program, was to provide a platform behind which the whole German working class movement could unite, but for the sake of unity, it made a number of concessions on points of principle to the followers of the splinter group led by Ferdinand Lassalle. What are the principal points clarified in Marx's critique? 1. He shows that the capitalist mode of production has created the material conditions for advancing to socialism, and deals with the way in which the social product will be distributed in socialist society. Socialism is only the first phase of communism, and is guided by the principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his labor. It will lead to one. The theory of the state was further developed by Stalin at the 18th Congress of the CPSU. B. Where he dealt with the functions of the socialist state, and the question of the withering away of the state, in conditions of the existence of socialist countries surrounded by a hostile capitalist world. Full communist society, the principle of which is, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. 1-2. He attacks the reformist slogan of a fair distribution of the products of labor, and exposes the theoretical confusion behind this slogan. For the distribution of the products of labor must always be a consequence of the mode of production. 2. He likewise attacks the reformist slogan of state aid under democratic control, and shows that the aim of the working class must be to revolutionize the present conditions of production. 3. He attacks the conception that, relatively to the working class, all other classes are only one reactionary mass. It is necessary to examine concretely the actual position of each class at each stage of history, and not lump them all together as reactionary. Thus the workers may fight together with sections of the capitalists against feudal survivals, together with the lower middle class for certain democratic demands, and so on. 3-4. He affirms the international character of the working class struggle for in opposition to the narrowly national aims of the Gotha program. 5. He refutes the conception of an iron law of wages, according to which the workers' real wages can never be raised above a minimum subsistence level. 5-6. He attacks the reformist slogan of a free state, and shows that, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. There corresponds to this also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. 6. Engels. Anti-Düring. Engels' great book Anti-Düring, or, to give it its full title, Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science, contains the most complete and comprehensive exposition of Marxist teachings, ranging over the whole field covered by Marxist theory. It is a masterpiece, clear, simple and witty in its style, profound in its content, demonstrating in every field the power of the Marxist method. The book is divided into 3 parts. 1. I. Philosophy. 2. Political economy. 3. Socialism. It is polemical in style, having been written, as its title indicates, against a certain drive. Eugen Düring, who was making a noise in the socialist movement in Germany in the 1870s. Düring claimed to be the inventor of a complete system of philosophy and science, founded on eternal and self-evident first principles, which enunciated the final truth about all things under the sun and then a few more, and which, in particular, would instruct socialists as to their future policy. In exposing Düring's nonsense and answering it, Engels 1. See Lenin, The State and Revolution, Stalin, Speech at Conference of Stakhanovites, 2. See Engels, Anti-Düring, Part 2, Marx, Capital, Volume Ill, ch. 51. 3. See, for example, the Communist Manifesto, and Address of the Central Committee to the Communist League. 4c. The Communist Manifesto. 5c. Wages, Price and Profit. 6c. Lenin, The State and Revolution. This book by Lenin contains quotations from and commentaries on a number of passages of the Critique of the Gotha program. Makes clear the Marxist standpoint. Andy During first appeared as a serial in the journal Forward, beginning in 1877, and was published as a complete book in 1878. Parts of it were subsequently published separately under the title Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Part 1, On Philosophy, begins by refuting the idea that we can deduce anything from self-evident first principles. Principles are only valid, says Engels, insofar as they can be shown to conform to nature and history. They are therefore not the starting point of investigation but its final result. He goes on to discuss the concepts of the unity of the world, and of time and space, and then devotes several chapters to natural science too, physics, chemistry and biology. In the chapters on biology in particular, the reader will find a profound discussion of the Darwinian theory of evolution and of the nature of life. Subsequent science has more and more confirmed the standpoint taken by Engels in these chapters. In Chapter 3 there is an important discussion on the nature of mathematics. Engels then devotes 3 chapters 9, 10, 11 to morality and law. He gives here a masterly treatment of the question, are there eternal truths? Turning to morals, he shows that in class society, morality is always a class morality. 3. There is a lengthy discussion on ideas of equality. The real content of the proletarian demand for equality is the demand for the abolition of classes, Engels declares. Any demand for equality which goes beyond that of necessity passes into absurdity. The next chapter discusses the question of so-called free will, and the relation between freedom and necessity. Freedom is knowledge of necessity. Point 4. The last 2 chapters of Part 1 turn to the laws of dialectics, and discuss the conceptions of dialectical contradiction, of the transformation of quantity into quality and of the negation of the negation. Engels makes the real meaning of these conceptions clear in a series of examples. The methods and basic ideas of dialectical materialism are also explained by Engels in the preface to the second edition of Andy During, and in the general introduction to the book as a whole. Part 2, On Political Economy, begins by defining political economy as the science of the laws governing the production and exchange of the material means of subsistence in human society. The mode of distribution of the products is always in the last analysis based on the mode of production and exchange. Therefore inequalities in the mode of distribution of the products develop as consequences of the existing mode of production. Point 5. From this standpoint Engels devotes 3 chapters to the criticism of the so-called force theory, which was put forward by During. According to this theory, inequalities in the distribution of products are due to a minority having somehow imposed this mode of distribution on society by force. It follows that capitalist society can be reformed by securing a 1c. Lenin, materialism and empirio-criticism. 2c. Also Engels, dialectics of nature. 3c. Also Lenin, tasks of the youth leagues. 4cf. Also what Engels says concerning the transition to the realm of freedom in socialism. Utopian and Scientific, extracted from Part 3 of Andy During. And C. Lenin, Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, ch. 3. 5c. Marx, Critique of the Gotha Program. More equal distribution of products, without altering the basic capitalist mode of production. Engels gives a detailed criticism of this theory. He shows how the development of property relations and political institutions has been based on economic development. A brilliant chapter is devoted to military science and to its economic basis. He ends by showing that all political power is originally based on an economic, social function, and that since the development of capitalism has reached the point where the rule of the capitalist class has become a hindrance to further social development, this rule, and with it the capitalist mode of production and exchange, must be inexorably abolished. This whole argument is of vital importance, not only in relation to During, but in relation to reformist theory generally, and is as topical today as ever. Engels then devotes 4 chapters to a polemical defense and exposition of the labor theory of value and of Marx's theory of surplus value and capital. Point 1. There follows a short chapter on ground rent 2 and a long chapter contributed by Marx giving a critical estimate of the leading writers on political economy before Marx. Point 3. Part 3, on socialism, opens with a critical account of the ideas of the utopian socialists, and then outlines the leading ideas of scientific socialism. These chapters were included in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and have been dealt with above in connection with that book. The last 3 chapters deal with Dühring's own proposals for the organization of production and distribution, and of the state, the family and education, in his ideal socialist society of the future. In this connection Engels discusses questions of the division of labor, the abolition of the antithesis of town and countryside, and the distribution of products, as these will actually present themselves in socialist society. In the last chapter, replying to Dühring's proposal to abolish religion, Engels briefly discusses the Marxist attitude to religion, for and in connection with the family and education he shows that these will develop in accordance with the real requirements of the citizens of the future socialist society, not in accordance with the eternal principles laid down by any utopian reformer. C. The history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks. Stalin, History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks. Written by J. V. Stalin, edited by a commission of the Central Committee of the CPSU. B. This book was first published in 1938. It makes available the experience and the lessons of the successful fight for socialism of the working people of the Soviet Union. It shows how the teachings of Marxism were applied and carried into practice in the struggle for socialism, and how they were further developed by Lenin and Stalin in the course of that struggle. It therefore introduces us to the fundamental ideas of Marxism-Leninism, showing how to apply and develop them in practice, and how to fight for them. And it arms us with knowledge of the laws of social development, confirming our certainty of the victory of communism throughout the world. 1 C. Marx, Wage Labor and Capital, Volume I. 2 C. Marx, Capital, Volume IL. Lenin, Agrarian Program of Social Democracy, ch. 3. 3 C. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value. 4 C. Lenin, Attitude of the Workers' Party to Religion. The history of the CPSU, B, may be roughly divided into 4 periods. A. From the foundation of the party to the First Russian Revolution of 1905-7. Chapters 1, 2 and 3 deal with the period up to and including the First Russian Revolution of 1905-7. Here we learn, first, of the rise of the industrial working class in Russia and of Lenin's struggle for the formation of a working class party. This struggle involved A. The fight for the fundamental ideas of Marxism against the populists, Narodnism, who denied that the workers must play the leading part in the revolution. B. The fight against opportunism in the working class movement. In the struggle first against the economists, who thought the workers should confine themselves to economic demands and not wage a political struggle, and then against the Mensheviks, who wanted to turn the working class party into an opportunist social democratic party of the West European type, Lenin established the principles of the working class party of a new type. 1. In the First Russian Revolution, which broke out in 1905, the Bolsheviks showed how to give leadership to the mass movement of the working class. In opposition to the Mensheviks who wanted to hold back the rising mass movement of the workers, Lenin and the Bolsheviks showed that the workers in alliance with the peasants must rise in revolt against Tsarism, overthrow it and clear the way for socialism. 2. What are the principal points we can learn about from the study of these chapters of the history of the CPSU, B? 1. The fundamental teachings of Marxism on the growth of the working class and its struggle, and the role of the working class in the fight for socialism. 2. The relation of the economic with the political struggle of the working class, the tasks of political leadership, and the necessity to fight against the economist, or narrow trade union type of reformism in the working class movement. 3. The political and organizational principles of the working class party of a new type. 4. The distinction and relationship of the bourgeois and the socialist revolution, and the leading role of the working class in the bourgeois revolution and in passing over from the bourgeois to the socialist revolution. 5. The strategic principles of working class struggle, uniting with all possible allies against the main enemy and isolating the compromising parties. 6. The mass political strike is a revolutionary weapon of the working class. B. The period of reaction and of the new rise of the working class movement, 1905–14. Chapters 4 and 5 deal with the period of reaction which followed the defeat of the 1905–7 revolution, and with the new rise of the working class movement before the First Imperialist War, 1914. After the defeat of the revolution, the Bolsheviks showed how to retreat in good order, how to regroup the forces of the working class, how to combine legal with illegal work, and to prepare for a new offensive against the landlords and capitalists. In this they had to fight 1C Lenin. What is to be done? 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Stalin, Foundations of Leninism. 2C Lenin, 2 Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. Lecture on 1905, Stalin, on the Problems of Leninism. Traitors and opportunists of all kinds, and above all the liquidators, who wanted to abandon all efforts to preserve the illegal organization of the party. At the same time, a number of intellectuals began a campaign to revise the fundamental ideas of Marxism in the light of the latest thing in bourgeois idealism. It was against them that Lenin in this period wrote his book Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, and in dealing with this, the history of the CPSU. B contains a classical exposition of the basic ideas of dialectical and historical materialism. Point 1. In this period, the Bolsheviks expelled the Mensheviks from the party and constituted themselves an independent Marxist party. 1912. The Bolshevik Party was able to extend its mass connections with the workers, to take the lead of the new struggles which were developing, to establish a mass daily newspaper, Pravda, and to carry on revolutionary propaganda and agitation through the Tsarist Duma. What are the principal points taught by the study of these chapters? 1. How to retreat in good order after a defeat, regrouping forces, preserving the illegal organization of the party and combining legal with illegal work. 2. The necessity of preserving the organization of the party, fighting against liquidationist tendencies, purging the party of opportunist elements and constituting an independent Marxist party of the working class. 3. The necessity to preserve intact, defend and develop the theoretical foundation of the party, dialectical and historical materialism. 4. How the party can extend its mass connections with the working class and take the lead of rising working class struggle. 5. How the party can carry forward the working class struggle in a reactionary parliament. 6. The role of a daily newspaper as leader and organizer of the mass movement. C. The Imperialist War and the Victory of the Great October Socialist Revolution, 1914–21. Chapters 6, 7 and 8 deal with the period of the Imperialist War, the revolutions of February and October 1917, and with the foreign military intervention and civil war. In the Imperialist War, Lenin exposed the Social Democrats who sided with their own imperialist governments, made his profound analysis of imperialism, the last stage of capitalism, and advanced the slogan, "Turn the imperialist war into civil war." 2. In February 1917, Soviets, elected councils of working people, were set up, the Tsar was overthrown by a mass uprising, and a provisional government was formed with the backing of the capitalists and bankers. Lenin in his April theses declared that the task was to pass straight on to the socialist stage of the revolution, which must place power in the hands of the working class in alliance with the poor peasantry. The whole gigantic experience of the proletarian revolution of 19,173 is set forth and analyzed in Chapter 7. Chapter 8 deals with the Civil War and intervention, and makes clear why the workers and peasants won. 1C Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. 2C Lenin, Imperialism, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, the Collapse of the End War. 3C Stalin, International Character of the October Revolution and the Tactics of the Russian Communists. What, then, are the principal points we learn about from the study of these chapters? 1. The policy of the working class in relation to war. 2. The nature of imperialism and the special features of the era of imperialism, the law of uneven development, and the possibility of the victory of socialism in a single country. 13. The fight against social chauvinism, i.e. against support of one's own imperialism in an imperialist war. 4. The strategy and tactics of the Bolshevik Party in the victorious October Revolution. 5. The international significance of the Great October Socialist Revolution. D. The building of socialism in the USSR, 1921-36. Chapters 9, 10, 11 and 12 tell how socialism was built in the USSR. 2. It was built in ceaseless struggle against internal and external enemies. Chapter 9 deals with the period of the transition from civil war to peaceful economic restoration, the new economic policy. Chapter 10 deals with socialist industrialization. Chapter 11 deals with the collectivization of agriculture. Chapter 12 deals with the struggle to complete the building of socialist society, which was crowned with the new Stalin Constitution of the USSR in 1936. With that, the building of socialist society in the USSR, a society without exploitation of man by man, was completed. The Soviet people began their new advance from socialism to communism. What are the principal points we learn about from the study of these chapters? 1. The significance of the new economic policy, as the policy by which the working class, in command of the state and of the key positions of economy, is able to lead the whole national economy towards socialism. 2. The alliance of the workers and peasants as an integral feature of the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. The path of socialist industrialization. 4. The path of collectivization of agriculture and of the elimination of the last exploiting class, the kulaks or capitalist farmers, in the countryside. 5. The development of the international situation after the October Socialist Revolution, and the relations between the land of socialism and the capitalist world. 6. The victory of socialism in the USSR and its expression in the Stalin Constitution of the USSR. At the end of the book, the chief conclusions to be drawn from the work and experience of the Bolshevik Party are listed. They are: 1. The victory of the working class is impossible without a revolutionary working class party. 2. This party must master the theory of Marxism-Leninism. 3. The victory of the working class is impossible unless alien tendencies within the ranks of the working class are defeated. 4. The party must wage an uncompromising struggle against opportunists and capitulators in its own ranks. 1. See Lenin, the United States of Europe slogan. 2. See Stalin's articles and speeches in the volume Problems of Leninism. 5. The party cannot lead the class unless it is ready to criticize defects in its own work, to acknowledge and correct its own mistakes. 6. The party cannot lead the class unless it constantly strengthens its connections with the masses and is ready not only to teach the masses but to learn from them. D. Leninism. Stalin. Foundations of Leninism. Stalin's Foundations of Leninism consists of a series of lectures delivered at Sverdlov University, Moscow, for new party members recruited during the Lenin enrollment which took place in 1924 after the death of Lenin. The lectures explained to the new members how Lenin had developed further the most important points of Marxism, the theory and practice of the working class struggle. The following are the principal points dealt with. 1. Stalin defines Leninism as the Marxism of the era of imperialism and of the proletarian revolution. He thus shows how Leninism is a further development of Marxism. 12. He explains how in the epoch of imperialism, i.e. of monopoly capitalism, the contradictions of capitalism have reached their extreme limit. Imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution. 2-3. He shows that the revolution is the result of the development of contradictions in the whole world system of imperialism. Hence the revolution begins, not as was formerly assumed, in the most advanced industrial countries, but in the weakest link in the chain of imperialism. Russia was the local point of all the contradictions of imperialism and the weakest link in the chain. That is why the first socialist revolution took place in Russia, and why Russia became the home of Leninism. 4. Stalin shows how the relatively peaceful development of capitalism in the pre-1914 period gave birth to the opportunism of the Second International, and how it therefore became necessary to overhaul the entire activity of the International. 35. He deals with the role of theory in the working class movement, and shows that the role of vanguard can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by advanced theory. 4. Theory must always be tested in living revolutionary practice, must not be allowed to degenerate into a dogma, but must be developed with the development of the revolutionary struggle. Revolutionary theory alone can give the movement orientation and direction. Practice without theory gropes in the dark. 6. Expounding Lenin's theory of the proletarian revolution, Stalin shows how the task of carrying through the bourgeois democratic revolution, i.e., doing away with feudal survivals and establishing democracy, must pass straight into the task of the socialist revolution, the conquest of power by the working class and the building of socialism. 57. He deals with the peasant problem, showing that the working class in order to fulfill its 1. See Stalin, interview given to First American Labor Delegation. 2. See Lenin, Imperialism. 3. See Lenin, the historical destiny of the teaching of Karl Marx. 4. See Lenin, what is to be done. 5. See Lenin, 2 Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, the 4th anniversary of the October Revolution. Revolutionary tasks must win as its allies and lead the mass of the peasants, marching with the whole peasantry as allies in the bourgeois democratic revolution, and then with the mass of the poorer and exploited peasants against capitalism. 18. He explains and defends Lenin's teaching that, in the epoch of imperialism, the socialist revolution can be victorious in a single country or in a group of countries alone, and that socialism can be built in one country. 29. He deals with the essence of the dictatorship of the proletariat, explaining a. That the dictatorship is necessary throughout the entire transition period after the seizure of power, in order to break the resistance of the exploiters, organize socialist construction and defend the country against foreign enemies. 3. B. That the dictatorship represents the domination of the proletariat, in alliance with all the working people, over the bourgeoisie, the rule of the majority over the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a higher form of democracy, proletarian democracy, which can emerge only as a result of smashing the organs of bourgeois rule. 4. C. Soviet power is the new state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, established in the Russian Revolution. Its chief characteristic is that it draws the mass organizations of the toilers and exploited into constant and unrestricted participation in state administration. 5.10. Stalin deals with the national question, 6, stressing that it has grown into a world question of the liberation of the oppressed peoples from imperialism. The national question can only be solved in the course of struggle to overthrow capitalist rule and imperialism. The working class must help and support all colonial liberation movements insofar as they tend to weaken imperialism. Stalin stresses the right of all nations to an independent political existence. Amalgamations of nations must be voluntary, based on mutual confidence, and must include the right to secession. 11. Stalin explains the elements of the science of leadership of the working class struggle, the way to determine correctly the strategy and tactics of the struggle at each stage. He shows that this depends on determining at each stage against what enemy the main blow is to be directed and what allies can be drawn into the struggle, strategy, and finding the correct forms of struggle, the right link in the chain, tactics. 12. He explains the Leninist conception of the working class party of a new type, the functions of such a party and how it must work. The party is 1. See Lenin, 2. Tactics, etc. Stalin, the party's 3 fundamental slogans on the peasant. Problem, report to 4th Congress of CPSU. B. 2. See Lenin, the United States of Europe slogan. 3. See Lenin, State and Revolution. Stalin, on the problems of Leninism. Marx, critique of the Gotha program. 4. See Lenin, the deception of the people, the proletarian revolution and the renegade. Kautsky, State and Revolution. Stalin, On the Problems of Leninism. Marx, Critique of Gotha. Program, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, The Civil War in France. 5C. Lenin, Tasks of the Proletariat in Our Revolution. Can the Bolsheviks maintain power? Stalin, Report to 15th Congress of CPSU, B. 6C. Stalin, Marxism and the National Question. A. The vanguard of the working class, closely bound up with the whole class. B. An organized detachment of the working class. C. The highest form of class organization of the proletariat. D. It acts as the instrument of the dictatorship of the proletariat. E. It must preserve strict unity and voluntary discipline. F. It must purge itself of all opportunists and traitors within its own ranks. The party, Stalin concludes, must learn the Leninist style of work, combining practical businesslike efficiency with Bolshevik zeal and enthusiasm. Stalin, On the Problems of Leninism. Stalin's On the Problems of Leninism, written in 1926, deals mainly with the dictatorship of the proletariat, false theories about which were being put forward at that time by Zinoviev and his followers. Stalin begins by emphasizing the international significance of Lenin's teachings. Leninism is not a special application of Marxism limited to Russian conditions. After explaining the principal ways in which the bourgeois revolution differs from the proletarian revolution, and after explaining how the bourgeois revolution grows into the proletarian revolution, Stalin shows that the proletarian revolution can only be carried through by the dictatorship of the proletariat. The fundamental thing in Leninism is Lenin's teachings about the dictatorship of the proletariat. The main tasks of the dictatorship of the proletariat are: 1. Suppression of the exploiters. 2. Building a firm alliance between the working class and the non-proletarian masses. 3. Organizing socialist economy. The dictatorship of the proletariat can be exercised only with the help of the mass organizations of the working class, and it is impossible without the guiding, unifying, leading role of the party. But the dictatorship of the proletariat is not the dictatorship of the party. It is the dictatorship of the class. As for the party, it does not function by methods of force and dictatorship. The method of persuasion is the principal method employed by the party in leading the working class. 1. E. Imperialism and the Proletarian Revolution. Lenin. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Lenin's imperialism was written in 1916, that is, in the midst of the imperialist war. In it he sought to lay bare the essential nature of imperialism, and thereby to unmask the policies of the imperialist powers, the roots of imperialist war, the treachery of the social democratic leaders who had gone over to the side of the imperialists, and to show the workers that the way forward was by the overthrow of imperialism. Lenin showed that imperialism is a new stage of capitalism, too, and he discovered its nature and its laws of development. He showed that the imperialist stage is the highest and last stage. 1C. Stalin, Report to 14th Congress CPSU. B. 2. An important explanation of this point, showing that imperialism is not a new economic system, is to be found in Lenin's report on the party program at the 8th Congress of the Russian CP. Of capitalism, and that the epoch of imperialism is at the same time the epoch of proletarian revolutions. Imperialism is defined shortly as the monopoly stage of capitalism. In giving this definition, Lenin makes clear its exact meaning with a wealth of factual material. Then he demonstrates the special features of this monopoly stage. 1. The concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that monopolies play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merging of bank with industrial capital has created finance capital and a financial oligarchy. 3. The export of capital has developed, as distinguished from the export of commodities. 4. International capitalist monopolies have been formed, which share the world among themselves. 5. The whole world is divided among the great imperialist powers. Lenin traces the process of development of imperialist powers. He shows how the export of capital gives rise to the annexation of colonial territories, and to the subjugation of millions of colonial peoples to imperialist domination. The world is divided among the imperialists. But no division of the world can ever satisfy them. For there is a law of uneven development, which means that as some imperialist powers expand and outstrip others, they put forward the demand for a redivision of the world corresponding to the new balance of forces. Hence imperialism is inseparable from imperialist wars. Lenin then shows that with imperialism all the parasitical features of capitalism are accentuated. With imperialism, capitalism is in decay, the stage is set for colonial liberation and for the proletarian revolution. At the same time, Lenin shows how in the imperialist countries the super profits made by imperialism are used to bribe a section of the working class, who therefore see their own interests as being tied up with those of imperialism. This is the basis for the growth of opportunism in the working class movement. Point 1. Lenin. The State and Revolution. The State and Revolution, written by Lenin on the eve of October 1917, sets forth the Marxist-Leninist teachings on the state. The last chapter, which was to deal with the experiences of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and February 1917, was never written. Lenin was interrupted by the advent of the October Revolution. The attitude to the state is a most vital question for the working class movement. Right-wing social democrats teach that the state is neutral and stands above classes. In this great book Lenin shows the falsity and treachery of this idea. He places before the reader the statements and arguments of Marx and Engels on the subject of the state, to defends and develops their teachings on the basis of an analysis of the experiences of the working class movement. What are the principal questions dealt with in the state and revolution? 1. Lenin shows that the state is an organ of class rule. It came into being as a result of society splitting into antagonistic classes, as an organ for the oppression of one class by one. See Lenin, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. 2. See Communist Manifesto, Critique of Gotha Program, 18th Brumaire of Lewis. Bonaparte, Civil War in France, Origin of the Family, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Another. Its characteristic feature is the existence of a public power, consisting of special bodies of armed men, prisons and coercive institutions of all kinds, a state bureaucracy. This state machinery has become perfected in the capitalist state. 2. Lenin shows that the working class cannot lay hold of the capitalist state machinery and use it for their own purposes, but must smash it and replace it by the proletarian state, the proletariat organized as the ruling class. The forms of bourgeois state, he says, are very varied, but they are all forms of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Similarly, the transition from capitalism to communism will create a variety of political forms, but their essence will invariably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The object of the proletarian dictatorship is to crush the resistance of the exploiters and prepare the way for classless society, communism. 3. Lenin deals in detail with the difference between bourgeois and proletarian democracy. We can and must imagine democracy without parliamentarism, he says, and analyzing the experience of the Paris Commune 1871, he shows how Marx recognized in the Commune a new form of democracy, proletarian democracy. At the same time, Lenin shows how the workers must always fight to defend and extend bourgeois democracy, because this provides the best conditions for waging the class struggle against the capitalists. He shows that the workers wage their struggle in alliance with all the oppressed people under capitalism, and how this class alliance must be continued and strengthened through the dictatorship of the proletariat after the defeat of the capitalists. 4. Lenin deals in detail with the meaning of the transition from socialism to communism, and with the economic basis of this transition. Socialist society is organized on the slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his work. As production increases and an absolute abundance of products becomes available, there will gradually be introduced communism, whose slogan is, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. At the same time, there will gradually disappear the antithesis between intellectual and manual labor, and between town and countryside. In the course of the transition to communism, the state will gradually wither away. 1. Lenin's lecture on the state, delivered in 1919 to students of Sverdlov University, presents the essential teachings about the state in a short and popular form. It is a splendid introduction for the beginner, who should read it before tackling the state and revolution. 1. But see further Stalin, Report to 18th Congress of CPSU. B. On Proletarian Democracy and the Socialist State. See further Lenin, The Tasks of the Proletariat in R. Revolution. Can the Bolsheviks maintain power? The Deception of the People, the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky and Stalin, Report to 15th Congress of CPSU, B. 3. Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Introduction. The philosophy of Marxism is dialectical materialism, and its application to the study of society is historical materialism. Dialectical materialism holds that we cannot understand things rightly unless we understand how they are connected together and how they are developing and changing. For nothing exists unconnected with other things, nor is there anything fixed and changeless, but everything is in continual change and motion. Dialectical materialism teaches us to pay attention to the opposite, conflicting tendencies which arise throughout nature and society, whose struggle results in change and development. In all development, gradual processes of growth, quantitative changes, lead to the emergence of something new, of a new stage of development, qualitative changes. Dialectical materialism holds that the cause of all the motion and change in the world does not lie in any higher, spiritual reality, but in the material world itself. For the world is by its very nature material. Matter is primary and spirit, mind, thought, etc., is secondary. Applying these ideas to human society, historical materialism is the discovery that the determining force of all social development is always to be found in the material life of society, i.e. in the mode of production, and that this provides the basis for the development of men's ideas and political institutions. From the development of the mode of production arises the class struggle, and the class struggle is the driving force of history. In this development, all ideas and institutions play either a reactionary or a revolutionary role, either helping to maintain and defend the old system of society, or mobilizing people to struggle against the old system. It has already been pointed out, Part 2, Introduction, that the student of Marxism should begin all his studies with Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, the Communist Manifesto, and the History of the CPSU, B. In these books the leading ideas of dialectical and historical materialism are already introduced and expounded. The reader who wants to come to an understanding of the philosophy of Marxism and its application to society should therefore begin with these, and firstly with Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Chapter 4 of the History of the CPSU, B contains a summary of the main ideas and principles of both dialectical and historical materialism. This is published separately, under the title Dialectical and Historical Materialism, by Stalin. This book should serve as the starting point for a fuller study of the principles of dialectical and historical materialism. But the new reader should not attempt to tackle it unless he has first understood the contents of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And here he will also derive great help from Stalin's Anarchism or Socialism. The next reading for the student who wishes to gain a fuller mastery of the ideas of dialectical and historical materialism will be Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach. Then can follow Lenin on Religion, and Engels' Introduction to the Dialectics of Nature, together with Chapter 9 of the same work, entitled The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, both published separately in Marx-Engels Selected Works, Volume 2. Only after this should he attempt to tackle the longer and more difficult works The Origin of the Family, Dialectics of Nature, Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, What the Friends of the People Are, and the first part of Anti-Düring. The last named work has already been described above, under Basic Principles. Other writings to which attention is drawn in this connection are Stalin's Marxism and Linguistics, the Marx-Engels Correspondence, several short articles, etc., by Lenin, and the early works of Marx and Engels which they wrote before the Communist Manifesto. Of the latter, The German Ideology and Poverty of Philosophy have both appeared in English translation. They are of very great importance as showing how Marx and Engels first developed and fought for dialectical and historical materialism, but many readers will find them difficult and will gain more from the later writings. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism is extracted from Chapter 4 of the History of the CPSU, B. Defining dialectical materialism as the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party, he explains that it is dialectical in its method, materialist in its theory. Historical materialism is the extension of the principles of dialectical materialism to the study of social life. This book contains a brilliant exposition of the principal features of 1. The Marxist dialectical method, 2. Marxist philosophical materialism, and 3. The Marxist science of society. In it are summarized the fruits of the whole experience of the application and development of Marxist theory in the course of the working class struggle for socialism. 1. Stalin shows how the Marxist dialectical method studies things always in their interconnection and in their movement. It studies development as taking place through the transformation of quantitative into qualitative changes and as the disclosure of the contradictions inherent in things. Whatever we may consider, there is always something coming into being and something ceasing to be, something rising and something dying, and so the struggle between new and old constitutes the motive force of all development. 2. Stalin shows how materialism holds that the world is by its very nature material, that matter is primary and thought secondary, and that the material world and its laws are fully knowable. 3. Stalin shows how society, too, develops according to regular laws, so that the study of history becomes a science. The working class party must be guided by knowledge of the laws of development of society. The determining force of social development is always to be found in the material life of society, and this provides the basis for the development of men's ideas, theories and political institutions. This does not imply, however, Stalin explains, that theories and political institutions are of no significance in social life. On the contrary, theories and institutions which arise on the basis of the new developing forces in material life themselves become an active force in that development. The chief force in the complex of conditions of material life that determines the development of society is the mode of production. Here Stalin distinguishes 1. The forces of production, consisting of a. The instruments of production and b. People with their production experience and skill, and 2. The relations of production, which in their totality constitute the economic structure of society. He shows how the forces of production continually develop. And corresponding to their development there are 5 principal types of relations of production: primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. 3 principal features of production are noted. A. Production never remains stationary for long, but is always in a state of change and development. B. Change and development of the mode of production always begins with change and development of the productive forces. First the productive forces change and develop, and then, depending on these changes and in conformity with them, the relations of production, the economic relations, change. C. The rise of new productive forces and new production relations begins within the old system and takes place independent of men's will and intentions. In the course of development, the existing system of production relations becomes a fetter on further development of the forces of production. Then follows a period of social revolution. New relations of production are established by the revolutionary overthrow of the old relations of production, and this is effected by class struggle, by the overthrow of the old ruling class and rise to power of a new ruling class. Stalin shows how the capitalist relations of production have become a fetter on further development, and how under socialism the way is free for a great further development of the productive forces. In conclusion, he quotes the passage from Marx's preface to the Critique of Political Economy in which Marx summed up the essence of historical materialism. In this passage Marx said, 1. In social production men enter into definite relations of production, which arise independent of their will. The sum total of these constitutes the economic structure of society. 2. This economic structure is the real basis on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. 3. Therefore the mode of production in material life determines the social, political and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being but, on the contrary, their social being determines their consciousness. 4. At a certain stage of their development, the forces of production in society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the forces of production these relations turn into their fetters. 5. Then follows an epoch of social revolution. The economic foundation is changed, and with it the whole superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. 6. In considering such transformations, we must distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, and the legal, political and ideological forms in which men become conscious of the conflict and fight it out. 7. No social order ever disappears until all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed, and new and higher relations of production never appear until the material conditions of their existence have matured within the old society. Engels. Ludwig Feuerbach. In Ludwig Feuerbach, the full title is Ludwig Feuerbach and the Outcome of Classical German Philosophy. Engels shows how the advance was made from Hegelian idealist dialectics to materialist dialectics, and from mechanical to dialectical materialism. Feuerbach was a German philosopher of the mid-19th century who turned from Hegelian idealism to materialism, and whose work had a big influence on Marx and Engels. This book by Engels, published in 1888, was originally written as a review article on a book on Feuerbach by C. N. Stark. The following are its principal contents. 1. Engels explains the basic difference between materialism and idealism. It arises from the question, which is prior, spirit or nature? Idealism says that spirit is prior to nature. Materialism says that nature is prior to spirit. Material being is prior to mind and ideas. Modern idealism has been specially concerned with the question whether we can gain reliable knowledge of material things, of the external world, and concludes that such knowledge is impossible. Engels refutes this view, and shows that practice demonstrates that our ideas can and do constitute a true reflection of external material reality. 12. He shows that the materialism of the past was mechanical materialism. Its great limitations were a. That it conceived of the motion of matter as exclusively mechanical motion, and could not grasp other forms of motion of matter, such as chemical or living processes. b. That it could give no account of development and evolution, either in nature or, still less, in history and human society. 3. He explains the essence of Hegel's philosophy and of the advance from Hegel to dialectical materialism. 2. Hegel considered every process of change and development as being a mere reflection of the self-development of the absolute idea, which does not only exist, where unknown, from eternity, but is also the actual living soul of the whole existing world. Marxism threw over such idealist fancies, and resolved to comprehend the real world, nature and history, just as it presents itself to everyone who approaches it free from preconceived idealist fancies. Engels shows that dialectical materialism regards the world as a complex of processes, not as a collection of ready-made things. Dialectics is the science of the general laws of motion, both of the external world and of human thought. 4. He discusses the essential ideas of historical materialism, as the application of dialectical materialism to the sphere of human society. He shows that the driving force of history is the class struggle, and that classes and class struggles are rooted in economic conditions. He goes on to discuss the economic foundations of the development of the state and of law, and then of political and social ideology, of religion, philosophy, etc. In criticizing Feuerbach's philosophy of religion and ethics, Engels attacks the approach which deals with abstractions such as humanity, instead of with real living men as participants of history. As appendix are added Marx's 11 Theses on Feuerbach, notes by Marx in 1845 in which he summarized his own ideas as opposed to mechanical materialism. Engels. The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State shows how the principles of historical materialism are applied in the interpretation of the development of primitive society and of the origins of civilization. Published in 1884, at a time when bourgeois ideas were becoming rife in the German Social Democratic Party, it was aimed at winning the workers away from reformist illusions to a scientific and revolutionary conception of history past and present. Engels' work was based on the discoveries of the American anthropologist, Louis Morgan, whose Ancient Society was published in 1877. Morgan, who had lived amongst and 1. See also Introduction to Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. 2. See Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Studied the American Indians, discovered in their kinship groups, or gens, the key to an understanding of primitive society and its development. The importance of Morgan's discoveries, which led him to conclusions fully in line with the materialist conception of history, was immediately recognized by Marx and Engels. In The Origin of the Family will be found 1. An account of the development of the social forces of production from the most primitive food gathering and hunting stage, through primitive agriculture, the domestication of animals, to the upper stages of barbarism, when the smelting of iron ore and the invention of the alphabet led to the beginnings of civilization. 2. The history of the development of the family, as the most elementary unit of human association, from group marriage to monogamy. Engels showed how the development of private property led to the transformation of family relations and to the subjugation of women. 1. And he deals with the future of the family in socialist society. 3. An account of the kinship organization, the gens, in primitive society, and of its disruption by the development of private property. 4. A demonstration of how the state arose with the division of society into antagonistic classes. 2. Engels traces the history of the rise of the state amongst the ancient Greeks, Romans and Germans, and shows in detail the nature and functions of the state as an instrument of the oppression of one class by another. 5. The last chapter contains a brilliant sketch of the whole development of civilization. Engels shows how classes and exploitation arose out of the division of labor, and how in consequence every advance in production has been made only at the cost of fresh sufferings of the exploited. Engels. Dialectics of Nature. Engels' Dialectics of Nature is an unfinished book. A few chapters were left by him at the time of his death in more or less finished form, but a great part of it consists merely of notes. In this book he intended to demonstrate how the discoveries of natural science confirm that the same dialectical laws which operate in human society operate also in nature, and how the dialectical method constitutes a great theoretical weapon of the natural sciences. When Engels died in 1895, the manuscripts of the Dialectics of Nature fell into the hands of Bernstein, the revisionist, who did not see fit to publish any part of them. They never saw the light until published by the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute in the USSR in 1927. Parts of this book are hard to follow for readers who have not at least some knowledge of the natural sciences, though those who have will find every page a veritable gold mine of ideas. But the general reader will find little difficulty with the introduction, which deals with the history of science, and shows how the old view of the universe as a static system has been replaced by a picture of universal evolution, with Chapter 2, which explains the dialectical law of the transformation of quantitative into qualitative changes, with Chapter 9, the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man, which gives a classical exposition of the Marxist view of human nature and its development, and with Chapter 10, Natural 1a collection of statements by Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin on women and their position in society is to be found in the volume Women and Communism. 2. C. Lenin, The State and Revolution. Science and the Spirit World, in which Engels gives his estimate of spiritualism. The introduction and the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man have been published separately in the 2-volume Marx-Engels selected works, and can be studied independently of the rest of the Dialectics of Nature. Chapters 3, IV and V, on the basic forms of motion, the measure of motion, and heat, contain vitally important material on the dialectical conception of the forms of motion of matter, and give a brilliant account of the dialectics of the science of mechanics. 2 chapters, on electricity, and tidal friction, are of mainly historical interest. The long chapter of notes contains material of the utmost interest and importance relating to the history of science, scientific method, the philosophy of science, the laws of dialectics, the materials of the special sciences. Lenin, what the friends of the people are, and how they fight the social democrats. Lenin's What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats, published in 1894, contains a most important defense and explanation of dialectical and historical materialism. The reader should consult Chapter 1, Sections 1 to 4, of the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks before reading this book, in order to understand its background. The self-styled Friends of the People are the Russian Narodniks, the social Democrats are the Marxists. The book belongs to the period of the fight for the establishment of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party on a Marxist basis. The Narodniks of the 90s had renounced revolutionary struggle against the Tsarist government. They were attacking Marxism by means of crude misrepresentations, were denying the growth of capitalism in Russia, were voicing primarily the interests of the rich farmers kulaks, and were singing the praises of kulak farming. In this book Lenin gave them their answer. 1. Replying to the jibe that Marxist historical materialism was an empty phrase and had never been properly expounded by Marx, Lenin answers, where does Marx not set forth his materialist conception of history? He analyzes the contents of Marx's Capital and shows how in Capital Marx dealt in a concrete way with the evolution of the economic formation of society, and demonstrated the way the social superstructure arises on the economic basis. Answering his opponents point by point, Lenin demonstrates the methodology of historical materialism. 2. Lenin completely exposes the misrepresentation of dialectics as an abstract scheme artificially imposed upon a given subject matter. And in this connection he exposes the misrepresentation that the Marxists believed Russia must first become a fully developed capitalist country before it could become a socialist country. 3. Lenin shows in detail how capitalism was developing in Russia and what inroads it was making into Russian peasant economy. 1. He shows how his opponents, under cover of all kinds of benevolent schemes, were supporting the landlords and capitalists. He deals with the rise of the industrial working class in Russia and shows how this rising class, in alliance with the exploited peasantry, is the force which can overthrow Tsarism and then advance to 1c. Lenin, the development of capitalism in Russia. The Socialist Revolution. Lenin. Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. Of this book by Lenin, A. Zhdanov wrote that, every sentence is like a piercing sword, annihilating an opponent. It is a devastating attack against modern idealism, a brilliant defense of the materialist standpoint, and a development of the basic ideas of dialectical materialism in the light of scientific discovery. It was written in 1908, in the period following the defeat of the 1905-7 revolution in Russia. The reader should consult the history of the CPSU, B, Chapter 4, Section 1, in order to understand the background. It was a time of great difficulty for the revolutionary working class movement in Russia. Reaction was making savage attacks upon the working class, and with this went an ideological offensive against Marxism, which fashionable writers represented as being exploded and out of date. This situation affected a group of the party intellectuals. They began to write books and articles claiming to improve Marxism and to bring it up to date, in the light of modern science, but in reality attacking its entire theoretical foundations. Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism was written against this group. It safeguarded the theoretical treasure of Marxism from the revisionists and renegades. But more than that, it provided a new materialist generalization of everything important and essential acquired by science, and especially the natural sciences, since Engels' death. The reader unused to philosophical literature will find an initial difficulty in understanding some of the terms used in this book, and the references to various bourgeois philosophers and scientists. The term, empirio-criticism, is used to denote a whole sect of modern idealists. Lenin shows that their theories are copied from those of the Anglo-Irish philosopher, George Berkeley, 1684-1753, who taught that material things have no real existence and that nothing exists but the sensations in our own minds. From the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724-1804, who taught that we can have no knowledge of things in themselves, which are mysterious and unknowable, and from the Austrian scientist and philosopher Ernst Mach, 1838-1916, who taught that bodies were nothing but complexes of sensations. Lenin's references to and quotations from these philosophers and their modern followers are, however, sufficiently detailed for the reader who follows the argument attentively to understand what it is all about, even without prior knowledge. In Materialism and Empirio-Criticism is contained 1. A devastating exposure of the idealism of the modern philosophy of science, which pretends that matter existing outside us is an abstraction and that what really exists consists of complexes of sensations. Ridiculing the scientific pretensions of this philosophy, Lenin asks, did nature exist prior to man? Does man think with the help of the brain? Science answers, yes, to both questions, and that means that matter objectively exists independent of and prior to human consciousness and sensation. 2. The clear assertion and explanation of the most important features of the materialist conception of nature, in particular, the practical test of knowledge, The relationship of relative and absolute truth. The absolute existence of matter, as the objective reality given to man in his sensations. The objective validity of causality and causal laws. The objectivity of space and time, as the forms of all being. 3. The analysis of the crisis in modern physics, which arises from the contradiction between new discoveries and the mechanistic ideas of classical physics. Lenin shows how two trends arise in physics, a materialist and an idealist trend. He exposes the sham pretensions of the latter and demonstrates that modern physics is in travail, it is giving birth to dialectical materialism. 4. The demonstration of the partisan character of all philosophy, of the irreconcilability of the struggle of materialism against idealism. Lenin shows that Marxism is materialism, irreconcilably opposed to every form of idealism and of attempted compromise between materialism and idealism. Lenin on religion. The Marxist-Leninist teachings concerning religion and the attitude of the Workers' Party towards religion 1 are summarized in 3 articles by Lenin: Socialism and Religion, the attitude of the Workers' Party towards religion, the attitude of classes and parties toward religion. In these articles Lenin demonstrates 1. That all religion is a form of spiritual oppression, the opium of the people. 2. That the program of the Marxist Party is based on materialist philosophy. 3. That the party resolutely demands the separation of church from state, and fights against both militant clerical reaction and liberal attempts to fog the minds of the people with religious illusions. 4. That the party does not include the propagation of atheism in its program, nor does it demand atheism from all its members, but regards the abstract preaching of atheism and the artificial fostering of religious divisions amongst the workers as harmful and as playing into the hands of reaction. Lenin on dialectical materialism, articles, letters and notes. Lenin's philosophical notebooks, published in the Soviet Union, contain very extensive material and comments on the essential ideas of dialectical materialism. Only a small part has been published in English translation, under the title On Dialectics. In these notes Lenin summarizes the essential ideas of dialectics, particularly the idea of the unity and struggle of opposites. In The Significance of Militant Materialism, written in 1922, Lenin sums up the tasks of the fight for materialism and the need for Marxists to make common cause with all those who adopt a materialist standpoint against idealism. In 2 letters to Maxim Gorky, Lenin expostulates with Gorky for flirting with the God-seekers. In Leo Tolstoy as a mirror of the Russian Revolution, Lenin applied the dialectical materialist method to problems of literature and literary criticism. He showed how Tolstoy reflected the contradictory outlook and moods of the Russian peasants. Very important explanations of the nature of the dialectical method are contained in 1. Step Forward, 2 Steps Back, the section headed, Something About Dialectics, and in Once More on the Trade Unions, the section headed, Dialectics and Eclecticism. Lenin deals with the communist attitude to morality in the tasks of the youth leagues. 1 See also Engels, Anti-Düring, Ludwig Feuerbach. Stalin, concerning Marxism in linguistics. Stalin's articles on linguistics, the science of language, its origin, nature and laws of development, were written and published in 1950, in reply to questions addressed to him by rank and file Soviet people in connection with current controversies concerning linguistics. In these articles Stalin exposes the false theory that language is a part of the social superstructure which arises on the economic basis, and that all language has a class character. He shows that language is a means of communication serving society as a whole, and that it changes and develops slowly, without violent revolutions or leaps. These articles are, moreover, of very great importance as demonstrating a. How Marxism understands the relation between basis and superstructure in society, b. How it understands the unity of the nation, c. How it is opposed to dogmatism and demands continual criticism and the testing of all conclusions. Marx-Engels correspondence. A number of important letters by Marx and Engels dealing with the principles and methods of historical materialism are contained in Volume 2 of Marx-Engels selected works. These comprise A. Marx to Annenkov, explaining the general principles of historical materialism as against Proudhon, who thought that society was a manifestation of eternal reason. B. Marx to Kugelmann, about the Paris Commune. C. And a series of letters by Engels to Schmidt, Bloch, Mering and Danielson, explaining how to understand and operate the method of historical materialism and exposing vulgar oversimplification of the method. These letters, especially the series by Engels, are most important reading for an understanding of historical materialism. A comprehensive selection of the Marx-Engels correspondence edited by Donator has been published in English. These letters range over the whole field of theoretical and practical activity covered by Marx and Engels during the whole course of their lives. They contain material and explanations on many points of principle and of detail of the very greatest value to students of Marxism. The volume is provided with an excellent index, and the student should consult the index in order to find where the topics he is interested in are dealt with in the correspondence. In an unfinished article on the Marx-Engels correspondence included in Marx, Engels, Marxism, Lenin pointed out that the epoch covered by the correspondence was just the epoch when the working class became demarcated from bourgeois democracy, the epoch of the rise of an independent labor movement, the epoch when the basic principles of proletarian tactics and policy were being determined. He therefore points out how valuable today is the great wealth of material contained in the correspondence for the fight against opportunist policies in the labor movement. If one were to attempt to define in one word the focus of the whole correspondence, Lenin concludes, that word would be dialectics. The application of materialist dialectics to the elaboration of all political economy, from its foundations, to history, natural science, philosophy and the policy and tactics of the working class, that is what interested Marx and Engels above all. Books by Marx and Engels prior to the Communist Manifesto. In the 3 years before the publication of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels jointly wrote 2 books, The Holy Family, or a criticism of all critical criticism, and the German Ideology. Marx himself wrote The Poverty of Philosophy and Engels The Condition of the Working Class in England 1844. They also wrote a number of articles, which appeared in such journals as the Rhineland Gazette, the German-French yearbook, Forward. These include Marx's criticism of Hegel's Philosophy of Law and the Jewish Question. 1. In The Holy Family and the German Ideology, Marx and Engels registered their break with the young Hegelian school to which they formerly belonged, and their adoption of the standpoint of historical materialism. Both books are polemical in form and style. The Holy Family has never been translated into English. Of the German Ideology, Parts 1 and 3 have been translated, but not Part 2. In Part 1 of the German Ideology, Marx and Engels work out, in a preliminary way, the basic conceptions of historical materialism. Carrying on social production, men institute social relations and forms of property. On this basis are produced definite modes of consciousness. In every epoch the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, and these are challenged by the new revolutionary ideas of the rising revolutionary class. Part 3 deals with contemporary writers, Max Stirner and the so-called true socialists. Marx's Poverty of Philosophy was written against Proudhon, who had just published his Philosophy of Poverty. In this book the ideas of historical materialism and scientific socialism are sharply formulated for the first time. Marx deals with the economic nature of the capitalist exploitation of the worker. He had not yet, however, formulated the distinction between labor and labor power, shows that economic relations are historically constituted and are not expressions of eternal economic categories, and formulates the doctrine of the class struggle. Dealing with the role of the trade union struggle and of the strike movement, Marx shows that scientific socialism must be united with the mass working class movement. Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844 deals, on the basis of Engels' own observations, with the exploitation suffered by the British working class in the period of the rise of large-scale modern industry. The conditions of the birth and development of the proletariat as a class are described, the competition between workers and their ever-growing combination, the housing and other social conditions, the conditions in particular industries and in agriculture. Engels deals with the development of the class struggle in Britain, the growth of an independent working class movement, and concludes that the union of socialism with Chartism will be the next step, and he foretells the inevitability of a proletarian revolution in Britain. 1A collection of manuscripts by Marx, belonging to this period, has been published in German under the title Economic Philosophical Manuscripts. An English translation is being prepared. 4. Political Economy. Introduction. Political economy is the science of the laws governing the production and exchange of the material means of subsistence in human society. And it is the development of the mode of production and exchange, i.e. the economic development of society, which is the basis of the whole of social development. From this historical materialist standpoint, Marxism investigates the laws of development of capitalist society, and discovers in the production of surplus value the key to understanding the capitalist economic system. Marxism thus exposes the essential nature of the exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class, and by so doing it arms the working class with an economic theory which enables us to understand the laws of development of capitalism, to see where capitalism comes from and where it is leading, to realize the nature of the class struggle of the working class against the capitalist class, and the historic mission of the working class to take power, expropriate the capitalists and build socialism. The essential work here is Marx's Capital, to the completion of which he devoted the greater part of his working life. But Capital is not a book for the beginner to take up. Before attempting to tackle it, the reader should have made himself familiar with socialism, utopian and scientific, and the Communist Manifesto, which will prepare him to understand the meaning of Marx's fundamental discovery of surplus value. In addition, there are several short works in which the basic idea of surplus value is explained in a popular form, and these need to be read before Capital. 2 pamphlets by Marx are at this point essential reading: Wages, Price and Profit and Wage Labor in Capital. Along with these, Lenin's Karl Marx will be found very helpful, and so will Engels. Karl Marx and Speech at the Graveside of Karl Marx, see above Part 1, together with Engels' reviews of Capital and of Critique of Political Economy. Having read the above, which are all comparatively short, the reader will be equipped with an elementary working understanding of the leading ideas of the Marxist science of political economy, and of the nature of surplus value in particular. If he wishes to go further from this point in the study of political economy, then he will be in a position to tackle Capital. To study Capital is a major undertaking. Marx himself, in a letter to the editor of the first French translation, warned about the difficulties. Science has no royal road, and only those who are not afraid of tiring themselves by climbing its steep pathways have a chance of attaining the clear light of its summits. For those who have not time to read right through the first volume of Capital, however, Marx himself gave some excellent advice in a letter to Dr. Kugelmann, November 30, 1867. This was to read the chapters on the working day, cooperation, the division of labor and manufacture, machinery, and finally primitive accumulation. The reading of the short introductory works mentioned above can, if necessary, be followed not at once by reading the whole of Capital, but by reading these particular chapters. But for the student who wishes to master the content and method of Capital, it is necessary to read it right through from the beginning, despite the difficulty of the early chapters. Only thus can he grasp the logical and scientific development of Marx's exposition, which on the basis of the analysis of commodity production and then of the formation of capital and surplus value goes on to reveal the economic law of motion of capitalist society. There are 3 volumes of Capital, and it is the first volume which is most essential. Engels pointed out in a letter to Victor Adler, March 16, 1895, that the most important chapters in Volume 2 were chapters 1, 4, 7, 8, 9 and in Volume 3, 1, 4, 8, 9, 13 to 27, 37, 38, 44 to 47. Marx originally intended to publish a 4th volume, parts of which are now available in English under the title Theories of Surplus Value. In it will be found a very useful exposition of the basic economic ideas of Marxism. Here also will be found Marx's fullest treatment of the nature of the cyclical economic crises of capitalism, concerning which there is a brief treatment in Volume 1, Chapter 25 and in Volume 3, Chapter 15, Section 3, and Chapter 30. A word must be added about the English translations of Capital. The standard translation of Volume I is that by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling, edited by Engels himself. This is at present available in the edition published by Allen and Unwin, edited by Donator. The Everyman edition, with an introduction by G. D. H. Cole, cannot be recommended, as the translation is less reliable. The only translation of Volumes 2 and 3 is that by Ernest Unterman. As guide and companion to the study of Capital, the student should use Engels' synopsis of Capital. He can also refer to Lenin's What the Friends of the People Are, see above Part 3, in which there is important material about capital and its significance. A very important exposition of Marxist political economy is contained in Part 2 of Engels' Anti-Düring, see above Part 2. The later chapters of this part of Anti-Düring expound some of the fundamental concepts of political economy, while the earlier chapters explain how the mode of distribution of products depends on the mode of production. Of the other works on political economy listed in this part, Marx's Critique of Political Economy is not essential reading, since the ground it covers was worked over again by Marx in the first part of Capital, and it is no easier to read. There remains Engels' important articles on the housing question, Lenin's development of capitalism in Russia, characterization of economic romanticism, and Lenin's articles on the agrarian question. The latter are essential reading for understanding the development of capitalism in agriculture. And on this special problem the reader can also refer to Capital. Volume 1, Chapter 15, Section 10, Chapter 25, Section 5e, Chapters 27 to 30 in Volume 3. Part 6. Marx, Capital. The aim of Marx's Capital is to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society. As long as there are capitalists and workers on earth, no book has appeared which is of as much importance for the workers, wrote Engels in reviewing Capital. The relation between capital and labor, the hinge on which our entire present system of society turns, is here treated scientifically for the first time. In Capital are embodied and worked out Marx's two great discoveries, the laws of development of human society, historical materialism, and surplus value, which is the key to the special law of motion governing the capitalist mode of production. By means of these discoveries, Marx in Capital shows the origins of capitalism, its development and how on that basis arise and develop the institutions and ideas of capitalist society. He exposes the innermost nature of the exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class, of the class struggle in capitalist society, and consequently the historical mission of the working class, which is to take power, to expropriate the capitalists, and to build socialism. It is a vast work, uncompleted by Marx at the time of his death. He completed and finished for the press only the first volume, which was published in 1867. After Marx's death, Engels devoted himself to the editing of the second and third volumes, which appeared in 1885 and 1894 respectively. Volume 1. The first volume explains the nature of capitalist production and its laws of development. Part 1. Since capitalist production is commodity production, in which the wealth of society presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, the exposition opens with an analysis of the nature of commodities. This analysis, which occupies the long first chapter, constitutes the most difficult part of the whole book. A commodity is essentially a product of labor, which has a use and which is produced for purposes of exchange. A commodity, therefore, has a twofold nature, a use value and an exchange value. Its use value is determined by its satisfying some human need. But what determines its exchange value? In other words, what have commodities in common by virtue of which they can be equated one to another as exchange values? Every commodity, Marx answers, is produced by expenditure of human labor, and so embodies a certain quantity of socially necessary labor time. The value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor time embodied in it. On the basis of his analysis of the nature of commodities and their value, Marx goes on to deal with the nature of money. A particular commodity, e.g. gold, becomes money when the values of all other commodities are expressed in terms of this money commodity. Money then functions as a universal measure of value and as the medium for the circulation of commodities. Part 2. The transformation of money into capital depends on the capitalist, as owner of money, being able to buy the labor power of the worker. Labor power becomes a commodity which is bought and sold. As with all commodities, its value is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor embodied in it, i.e. by the amount of socially necessary labor required to maintain the worker. When this commodity, labor power, is used, i.e. when the worker is set to work, it is able to produce a new value greater than its own. If, for example, the worker works 6 hours to reproduce the value of his own labor power, then in all the time he works over 6 hours he produces a surplus value. This is appropriated by the capitalist. Part 3. Marx then deals in detail with the production of surplus value, which provides the key to understanding the whole process of capitalist production. The labor process, he shows, involves 3 factors. 1. The personal activity of man, i.e. work itself. 2. The subject of work. And 3. The instruments. In the labor process, man's activity with the help of instruments of labor effects an alteration designed from the commencement in the material worked upon. The capitalist buys labor power in order to use it for the production of commodities, of values and of surplus value. His capital is divided into constant capital, which is expended on raw materials and instruments of labor, machinery, etc., and variable capital, which is expended on buying labor power. The values of the raw material and instruments consumed in the labor process pass unchanged into the value of the product. The surplus value accrues solely from the expenditure of labor power, i.e. from the worker working longer than the time necessary to reproduce the value of his own labor power. The rate of surplus value, which measures the degree of exploitation of the worker, is defined, therefore, as the ratio of the total surplus value produced to the variable capital expended. In capitalist production there is a constant drive to increase the rate as well as the mass of surplus value, i.e. to increase the exploitation of the worker. Therefore in the beginning of the capitalist epoch there occurred a drive to lengthen the working day to its utmost limits. In the chapter on the working day, Marx brings forward evidence of this, especially from Britain. Part 4. The rate of surplus value can also be increased by increase in the productivity of labor due to use of machinery. For such increase in the productivity of labor reduces the amount of labor time socially necessary to maintain the laborer, and so has the effect of reducing the time which the worker works for himself in relation to the time he works for the production of surplus value for the capitalist. While surplus value produced by prolongation of the working day is called absolute surplus value, that arising from curtailment of necessary labor time is called relative surplus value. Capitalist production has passed through 3 phases: simple cooperation, where a number of individual workpeople are brought together, each producing a finished article; manufacture, where numbers cooperate to produce the finished article by division of labor, each performing a partial operation; and modern industry using power-driven machinery. In the chapter on machinery and modern industry, Marx explains the nature of machinery and deals with its development and its effects upon the workers. Part 5. Marx then deals with some problems of the production of both absolute and relative surplus value, showing the effects of changes in the length of the working day and of change in both the productiveness and intensity of labor. Part 6. The next part deals with the question of wages. Wages are wrongly regarded as the price of labor, since labor has itself no value. What is bought and sold for wages is the worker's labor power. Piece wages are a converted form of time wages, just as time wage are a converted form of the price of labor power. Part 7. In the process of the circulation of capital, three phases are involved. 1. A sum of money is converted into means of production and labor power. 2. By the application of labor the means of production are converted into commodities, whose value contains the capital originally advanced plus a surplus value. 3. By the sale of the commodities produced, the value is again realized in money. Marx shows that the process of capitalist production is at the same time a process of accumulation of capital. A given capital does not merely reproduce itself, but by the conversion of surplus value into capital multiplies itself many times over. As capital accumulates, the proportion of constant to variable capital increases. There takes place a centralization of capital into the hands of bigger capitalist concerns, and an industrial reserve army is continuously formed. This is composed of workers who have become temporarily redundant, due to the relative diminution of the variable constituent of capital, i.e. that part used to buy labor power, while the total capital increases. It serves as a reservoir of labor for capitalist exploitation. This is the general law of capitalist accumulation. As a result, there is an accumulation of social misery corresponding with the accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth for the capitalist class is at the same time accumulation of misery for the working class. Part 8. In order that capitalist production should become possible, there must first be an initial accumulation of wealth available for conversion into means of production and labor power, and a supply of free laborers, i.e. the creation of a propertyless proletariat with nothing to sell but labor power. The process whereby these conditions were first realized is the process of primitive accumulation. Drawing particularly from English sources, Marx shows that it involved 1. Colonial plunder, and 2. The expropriation of the peasantry from the land. The forcible conversion of former small peasant cultivators into wage laborers, compelling them to sell their labor power and to buy the means of subsistence they formerly produced for themselves, was a major factor in creating the home market for capitalist production. Lastly, in the chapter entitled The Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation, Marx shows how the laws of development of capitalism inevitably lead to the end of capitalism. Volume 2. A number of problems are left over for solution from the first volume of Capital, though the first volume contains all the essential ideas for their solution. These problems occupy the second and third volumes. In Volume 1 Marx had dealt with the essential process underlying capitalist production, the production of surplus value. In Volumes 2 and 3 he studies how the production of surplus value is expressed in the familiar capitalist terms, in profit and the rate of profit, in the processes of capitalist circulation, in interest in the credit system, etc. Thus while Volume 1 deals with the underlying essence of capitalist production, Volumes 2 and 3 show how this essence is manifested in, gives rise to, all the surface appearances of capitalist economy, with which alone the capitalist economists concern themselves. The second volume deals with the circulation of capital. It is divided into three parts. The first part analyzes the series of transformations through which a given capital has to pass, from money to commodities and back to more money. Money capital, having been advanced to by means of production and labor power, becomes productive capital. Then follows the process of production itself, as a result of which a mass of commodities is produced, in which capital appears as commodity capital. Lastly, there comes the reconversion into money as a result of the sale of these commodities. Capital must continually rotate through this entire cycle, and Marx analyzes the conditions required for the realization of each stage and the expenses involved at each stage. This leads to the analysis of turnover, which occupies the second part. In this connection the distinction is made between fixed and circulating capital, the fixed capital being that part machinery, buildings, etc., which only partly transfers its value to the product during each separate turnover, while the circulating capital, raw materials and capital expended in wages, has to be renewed after each turnover. The period of turnover has two sections, the time of production and the time of circulation, and the shorter the period of turnover in each of these two sections, the larger the appropriated surplus value, other conditions remaining the same. The third part deals with the reproduction and circulation of the aggregate social capital. Here Marx divides the total product, and therefore the total production, of society into two great departments, I. Means of production, 2. Means of consumption. He shows how in the total process of circulation of the aggregate social capital both the constant and variable capital employed in each of these departments is reproduced. Volume 3. The third volume, entitled Capitalist Production as a Whole, is concerned with rent, interest and profit. In Volume 1 Marx explained the nature of surplus value, making it clear that the profit comes from surplus value. The rate of surplus value was defined as the ratio of the total surplus value produced to the variable capital expended. Marx now shows that, as distinct from the rate of surplus value, the rate of profit is defined by the ratio of the total surplus value produced to the total capital advanced, including the constant as well as the variable capital. Marx then explains the formation of an average rate of profit. It is clear that the rate of surplus value being given, the rate of profit must be higher according as the proportion of variable to constant capital is greater. But due to competition and the flow of capital from one branch of production to another, the products of one branch are sold above their value and those of another below their value, resulting in the formation of an average rate of profit over capitalist industry as a whole. From this follows the determination of the price of production, which is equal to constant and variable capital expended plus the average profit. Deviations of market prices from price of production are explained by variations of supply and demand. Marx then demonstrates the very important law of the falling rate of profit. Since, given the rate of surplus value, the rate of profit must be less where the proportion of constant to variable capital is greater, it follows that as the proportion of constant capital increases over industry as a whole, as a result of increasing mechanization and higher productivity of labor, the rate of profit for industry as a whole must fall. This tendency of a falling rate of profit can only be counteracted by a corresponding increase in the rate of surplus value, i.e. by increasing the exploitation of the worker. Marx analyses in detail the nature of commercial and financial capital and of interest in the credit system. Commercial or merchant's capital plays a special part in the process of circulation, facilitating the sale of products of capitalist industry and claiming in return a share of surplus value amounting to at least the average rate of profit. Money capitalists also play a special role in lending out money at interest, the interest being paid out of a portion of the profit. As the credit system develops, a new aristocracy of finance emerges. The operative direction of production then begins to be separated from the ownership of capital. The development of the credit system accelerates the accumulation of wealth into a few hands and reduces the process to a colossal form of gambling and swindling, and it creates all the prerequisites for the conversion of capitalist property into social property. Marx shows that the merchant and the usurer are older than the system of capitalist production, and existed in pre-capitalist conditions. Merchants and usurers flourished in both slave and feudal society, and Marx indicates the role they played in slave and in feudal production. The existence of a numerous and powerful class of merchants and usurers did not, by itself, tend to promote a change in the mode of production. Marx then analyzes the nature of ground rent, making the important distinction between differential and absolute ground rent. Absolute rent arises from the generally higher proportion of variable to constant capital in agriculture. This means that a higher rate of profit is realized in agriculture, which is not leveled down to the average rate where private ownership of land prevents the free flow of capital into agriculture. The difference constitutes the absolute rent. Differential rent arises from the greater profitability of the cultivation of better as compared with worse land. The additional profit accruing from working the better land as compared with the worst land under cultivation constitutes differential rent. The whole analysis in Volume I of Capital makes it clear that the working class as a whole is exploited by the capitalist class as a whole, the total surplus value produced being shared out in a variety of ways and in a variety of forms among a number of different capitalist interests. The last part of Volume 3 on the revenues and their sources was never finished. In it, Marx formulates criticisms of the assumptions of bourgeois political economy, and provides a brilliant summary of the basic features of the scientific analysis of capitalist production as a whole. Marx. Critique of Political Economy. Marx's Critique of Political Economy was published in 1859. It consists of only 2 chapters on commodities and money, and covers the same ground as Part 1 of Capital. It was in fact Marx's first formulation of the theory of commodities and money, from which follows the discovery of surplus value and the whole analysis of the nature and laws of development of capitalism contained in Capital. Marx originally intended it to be the first part of a complete treatise on political economy. He modified his plans, however, and 8 years later published Volume 1 of Capital. There is nothing in Critique of Political Economy which is not worked out more fully in Capital, except that the critique contains polemics against bourgeois political economists omitted in Volume 1 of Capital. These polemics are more fully developed in Theories of Surplus Value, and in the chapter, From the Critical History, which Marx contributed to. Engels and Dühring, Part 2, Chapter 10. The preface to Critique of Political Economy contains Marx's classic formulation of the principles of historical materialism, dealt with above in connection with Stalin's dialectical and historical materialism. Engels on Capital. Reviews written by Engels of Critique of Political Economy and of Capital contain an invaluable introduction to the study of Capital itself. In reviewing the Critique of Political Economy for a German paper The People, Engels points out that scientific political economy arose in Germany with the rise of the working class party. It is grounded on the materialist conception of history. Engels deals with Marx's relation to Hegel, and then shows how Marx's dialectic was applied in explaining the nature of commodities. 2 reviews of Capital by Engels, written for the Leipzig Democratic Weekly and for the London Fortnightly Review, give a simple account of Marx's discovery of surplus value. Engels began the writing of a synopsis of Capital, which he carried on as far as Part 4. This synopsis is a most valuable guide and companion to the study of Capital itself. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value. Theories of Surplus Value is taken from manuscripts which Marx left for the last volume of Capital and which Engels intended to edit and publish as Volume 4 of Capital. Engels did not live to accomplish this task, which was undertaken by Karl Kautsky, who published the manuscripts under the separate title, Theories of Surplus Value. Kautsky's editorial work has since been sharply criticized in the Soviet Union, where a new complete edition of Theories of Surplus Value is at present under preparation. Theories of Surplus Value consists of a series of studies of economists who preceded Marx, and was arranged by Kautsky in 3 books. 1. Early Theories of Surplus Value up to Adam Smith. 2. David Ricardo. 3. From Ricardo to the Vulgar Economists. None was translated into English until a translation of selections from Parts 1 and 2 appeared in 1952. Marx had the highest regard for the classical English political economists who preceded him, and Lenin in his 3 sources and 3 component parts of Marxism refers to classical English political economy as one of the main sources of Marxism. Hence, Marx's study and criticism of this classical political economy is of the greatest interest and helps to clarify many aspects of his own work. Theories of Surplus Value is likewise of very great importance for the understanding and criticism of bourgeois economic theory, since many of the still current arguments which seek to justify capitalist profits are merely refurbished versions of old views critically examined by Marx in this work. Of special importance in the sections published in English translation will be found 1. Marx's re-explanation of his own analysis of surplus value in the light of a critique of the discoveries and errors of the physiocrats, together with the whole analysis of this school of political economy, which corresponded to the period when capitalism was arising within decaying feudal society. 2. Marx's examination of the inconsistencies of Adam Smith, who realized that profit comes from unpaid labor, but who fell into confusion over the question of the value of labor. 3. Marx's explanation of the question of price of production, the rate of profit, and the process of accumulation of capital, in connection with the critique of Ricardo, who, as he shows, failed to distinguish surplus value from profit and mixed up price of production with value. 4. Marx's analysis of the causes of the cyclical crises of capitalism. Marx, Wage Labor and Capital. In 1847, Marx gave a series of lectures at the German Workers' Society in Brussels, aimed at making clear to a working-class audience the key concepts of political economy. These lectures were subsequently, 1849, published as a pamphlet, Wage, Labor and Capital. Their main aim is to help the worker to understand his own economic position in capitalist society. Marx explains that the worker sells his labor power to the capitalist and that the wages he receives are the price of his labor power. He explains how prices are determined and consequently how wages are determined. He proves that there is no community of interests between workers and capitalists, but that their interests are diametrically opposed. Explaining the distinction between real wages and money wages, Marx shows that there exists an inverse ratio between real wages and profits. The constant drive of the capitalist is to rationalize production, cheapen goods, increase competition amongst the workers and keep wages down. Marx, Wages, Price and Profit. This pamphlet by Marx, which is also known as Value, Price and Profit, contains a simple explanation of the basic ideas of political economy, value and surplus value. This explanation begins with the 6th chapter. Marx explains what is the value of commodities, the relation of value and market prices, the value of labor power, the origin and nature of surplus value, the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit, how surplus value is decomposed into rent, interest and profit. Thus all the most important conceptions worked out in Capital are here introduced to the reader in an easy and popular way. The pamphlet is based on 2 speeches made by Marx to the General Council of the International Working Men's Association in 1865. The First International was considering its attitude to the contemporary strike movement and to demands for raising wages. An English delegate, John Weston, put forward the idea that higher wages could not improve the conditions of the workers, since if wages went up, so would prices. In answering him, Marx shows that wages can rise at the expense of profits. He cuts through all Weston's confusions about currency circulation, supply and demand, the regulation of prices, and proves that a general increase in wages would not mean a rise in prices but a fall in profits. Marx here demonstrates how the science of political economy is an instrument for showing the workers the way forward, and for clearing up such confusions as those of John Weston. Though spoken nearly 100 years ago, his words remain very contemporary. The same argument continues in the working class movement. In concluding his address, Marx shows that there is no economic law which fixes the level of wages and profits. How much shall be paid in wages, how much shall go for profits, is determined in the last analysis by the relative strength of the contending classes, by the class struggle. He states in conclusion that instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, the working class should inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. Engels. The housing question. In this book Engels deals with a secondary consequence of the economic law of development of capitalism, the housing question. He shows how not only bad and unhealthy housing, but a housing shortage and high rents, affecting not only the working class but large sections of the middle class also, result from the rapid development of industrial capitalism. He discusses various schemes proposed for solving the housing problem, and concludes that this problem is integrally connected with capitalism and that only by the ending of capitalism will the housing question be finally solved. It first appeared in the form of 3 articles in the German socialist press in 1872, when the industrial boom following the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and the rapid growth of the cities, had made the housing problem loom large in Germany. The articles are strongly polemical in character, directed against petty bourgeois socialists, revivers of the discredited ideas of Proudhon, who were pushing the housing question into the forefront and pretending that their quack remedies for it would transform society. What are the principal questions dealt with in the articles? 1. Engels exposes the fallacy of those socialists who fancy they can transform capitalism by a few legal reforms. 2. Engels deals with the proposal to solve the housing problem by ensuring that every worker shall own his own little house. He shows that this is a utopia, and moreover not a socialist proposal but a thoroughly reactionary proposal. And in this connection he explains the true economic relation between landlord and tenant and the nature of house rent. The landlord-tenant relation is not like the relation between capitalist and worker, but is based on an ordinary sale and purchase transaction between two citizens. The landlord sells the use of the house to the tenant. 3. Engels proves that the capitalists, while forced to agree to various steps to alleviate the housing problem, do not want to solve it, and that housing schemes initiated by the capitalist state do not solve it either. He enters in some detail into questions of building societies, state aid for housing, factory housing schemes, town planning. 4. Engels shows how, with the seizure of power by the proletariat, existing housing can be utilized for the benefit of the working class, and he shows how the eventual solution of the housing question will be bound up with the abolition of the antithesis between town and countryside. Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. This book, which should be read in conjunction with the first 3 chapters of the history of the CPSU, is an unexcelled example of the application of the Marxist method in the investigation of the development of the economy and class relations in a particular country. Lenin worked on it during his imprisonment in 1896, and it was finished in exile in Siberia. Its analysis of the social and economic development in Russia provided the basis for the Bolshevik program and strategy in the 1905-7 revolution. Lenin shows how the development of capitalism in Russia was increasing the social division of labor, dividing the producers into capitalists and workers, and creating a home market. Parts of the book only have been translated into English. These are the parts specially concerned with the development of capitalism in Russian agriculture, the growth of capitalist farming amid numerous survivals of serfdom, and the consequent disintegration of the peasantry, with the appearance of a rural bourgeoisie on the one hand and of rural wage workers on the other. Lenin, A Characterization of Economic Romanticism. This was written in 1897 and is directed against the economic theories of the populists Narodniks, whose standpoint was based on a utopian desire to halt the development of capitalism and return to small-scale production. In it Lenin criticizes the theories of the Swiss economist Sismondi, whose views were highly prized by the Narodniks. This criticism contains illuminating explanations of Marxist economic analysis, and of its relation to the classical bourgeois political economy. Lenin demonstrates that the progressive character of capitalism consists in the development of the forces of production, and that by bringing to a head the contradiction between social production and private appropriation, capitalism prepares the ground for socialism. He contrasts the scientific analysis of Marxism with the romantic views of Sismondi, who recognized the contradictions of capitalism but failed to analyze them scientifically or to understand the laws of capitalist development. Lenin deals especially with the question of the formation of the home market, the connection of production and consumption, the accumulation of capital, and the causes of capitalist crises. Lenin on the agrarian question. In his writings on the agrarian question, Lenin provides, in the first place, an analysis of the laws of development of capitalism in agriculture, based on a wealth of statistical information from European countries and from the USA. This analysis is to be found in his writings. Capitalism in Agriculture. The Agrarian Question and the Critics of Marx. New data on the laws of development of capitalism in agriculture. The agrarian program of social democracy in the First Russian Revolution. These writings are difficult to follow unless the reader has previous acquaintance with the main ideas of Marxist economics. They are an important continuation and application of the principles of Marx's Capital. They constitute an indispensable part of Marxist studies, particularly for those concerned with agricultural questions. They are all polemical in style, being directed against writers who either denied the capitalist development of agriculture altogether or misrepresented its laws of development. In Capitalism and Agriculture, Lenin deals with a Narodnik writer who had criticized Kautsky's book on the agrarian question, written at a time when Kautsky was still a Marxist. Lenin makes clear a number of fundamental characteristics of the development of capitalism in agriculture. The proportion of constant to variable capital increases in agriculture. As in industry, there takes place a concentration of land ownership in the hands of landlords and mortgage corporations. Large-scale production supplants small-scale, not merely by increase in the area of farms but also by increase of intensity of production on a small area. There is growth of wage labor and of the utilization of machinery. He then shows further how the development of capitalist agriculture is hampered by various difficulties and contradictions, particularly ground rent, the growth of the urban at the expense of rural population, and competition of cheap grain from newly developed areas overseas where the producers are not burdened by ground rent. The same questions are again taken up in the Agrarian Question and the Critics of Marx. Here, after a fundamental explanation of the fallacy of the so-called law of diminishing returns, and an exposition of the Marxist theory of ground rent, Lenin deals especially with the question of large-scale versus small-scale farming, exposing the error of those who imagine that small farming is more progressive. 1. New data on the laws of development of capitalism in agriculture brings out further the points already explained by means of a profound analysis of the development of agriculture in the United States. Amongst other points emphasized both in this and the previous articles is the essentially capitalist character of agricultural cooperation, in a capitalist state, through farmers' cooperative associations. Point 2. In the agrarian program of social democracy in the First Russian Revolution, 1. See Engels, The Peasant Question in France and Germany. 2. But see also Lenin on cooperation. 1905-7, Lenin gives a detailed analysis of the existing system of land ownership in Russia and of the tasks of the agrarian revolution in Russia. The key issues are confiscation of the estates of the landlords and nationalization of the land. Lenin proves that the nationalization of the land, in a capitalist state, does not destroy capitalism in agriculture but, on the contrary, by removing the main obstacles to the free investment of capital in agriculture, furthers its development. This point is developed in Chapter 3, which also contains a simple exposition of the Marxist theory of ground rent. Chapter 3 of this book is published separately in the 12-volume edition of Lenin Selected Works, Volume 12. The other chapters, I, 2, IV and Conclusion, are included in Lenin Selected Works, Volume 3. 2 writings by Lenin dealing with the agrarian question in pre-revolutionary Russia must be noted here, in addition to the treatment of the development of capitalism in Russian agriculture contained in the relevant chapters of the development of capitalism in Russia. In the agrarian question in Russia at the end of the 19th century, Lenin gives a detailed analysis of the types of farming in Russia and of their development, of the classes, of the process of division of the peasants, and concludes that 2 alternative paths of development were open to Russian agriculture: the Russian path, through the growth of kulak farming, or the American path, through the nationalization of the land. This analysis provided the basis for the agrarian program of Russian social democracy, including its demand, voiced later, for the nationalization of the land. In the booklet to the rural poor published in 1903 for illegal distribution amongst the peasants, we find a model of the simple, popular and forceful presentation of the party's whole economic and class analysts and program of action.